its windows gaping open like hollow eyes. Ivy crept up the walls, clutching at the crumbling brick like it was trying to hold the place together. The front doors hung crooked on their hinges, swaying slightly in the breeze as if inviting me inside. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity tugged harder than my caution ever could. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint scent of mildew. My footsteps echoed down the empty hallway, muffled by peeling linoleum tiles that curled at the edges. Old wheelchairs and rusted gurneys lined the walls, left behind as if the last shift ended in a hurry. A faint light filtered in through broken blinds, casting long shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking. I made my way through the first floor, careful to avoid loose boards and shattered glass. The nurse's station was still cluttered with paperwork, cups and pens, all coated in a fine layer of dust. I ran my fingers over a thick ledger, its pages brittle and stained with age. Most of the entries stopped abruptly in the same month and year, the handwriting becoming more rushed toward the end. There was something unsettling about how everything felt suspended in time, as if everyone had simply walked away and never came back. I pushed open one door after another, each room telling the same story: beds stripped bare, personal items left behind, and patient charts still hanging at the foot of each bed. Some rooms had deep gouges in the walls, as if someone had clawed at them desperately. I climbed the stairs to the second floor, the steps creaking loudly beneath my weight. At the top, I found a heavy door with a rusted lock twisted in place. Oddly enough, the door stood slightly ajar, as if it had been forced open recently. My pulse quickened as I pushed it open with the flat of my hand, revealing a long hallway with more patient rooms on either side. As I walked down the hall, the air grew colder. The dust on the floor was thick, except for a set of footprints leading ahead of me. They were fresh, too fresh, and they vanished into one of the rooms near the end of the corridor. I stopped at the door, heart pounding, and pressed my ear against the wood. There was no sound from inside, just an eerie, heavy silence. I eased the door open slowly. The room was different from the others. Filing cabinets lined the walls, some drawers half open and spilling over with yellowed papers. On a battered desk sat a stack of patient charts, each one thick and heavy with records. I stepped inside, ignoring the nagging feeling that I wasn't alone. I picked up one of the charts, flipping it open. The patient's name was written neatly at the top, along with their date of birth and admission. Further down, there was a date of death, circled in red ink. Over it, someone had scrawled the word discharged in black marker, the letters harsh and uneven as if written in a hurry. I opened another chart, and then another. Every single one had the same pattern, the date of death clearly recorded, then crossed out and replaced with discharged. My mouth went dry as I realized there were dozens of these charts stacked here. Each patient had supposedly left the facility alive, despite being marked as dead. I glanced around the room again, suddenly aware of just how cold it was. The footprints I had seen earlier ended right in front of the desk where I stood. I turned slowly, half expecting someone to be standing behind me, but the room was empty. The only sound was my breathing, shallow and fast in the stillness. I backed toward the door, keeping my eyes on the room, but something on the floor caught my attention. There was a faint trail of something dark smeared across the linoleum. It led from one of the filing cabinets to a small door in the back of the room, almost hidden behind a stack of chairs. I hesitated, then stepped closer. The door was low, like a maintenance hatch, and when I pulled it open, a wave of cold air rushed out. Beyond it was a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. I shone my flashlight inside but couldn't see the bottom. For a long moment I stood there, considering whether to go down. Something told me I shouldn't, but curiosity won out again. I descended slowly, each step groaning under my weight. The air grew colder the deeper I went, carrying a faint, metallic smell that turned my stomach. At the bottom of the stairs was another door, this one newer than anything else I had seen so far. It was bolted from my side, as if someone had wanted to keep something in rather than out. I undid the bolt and pushed the door open. The room beyond was dimly lit by a flickering fluorescent bulb. It was small and empty, except for a single bed and what looked like restraints bolted into the floor. On the bed was a chart, identical to the ones I had seen upstairs. I picked it up with shaking hands and read the name at the top. It was mine. My throat closed up as I read through the rest of the chart. There was an admission date from years ago, followed by a death date that matched today. Over it, in the same jagged handwriting, was the word discharged. My hands trembled as I lowered the chart and backed toward the door. But the door was already swinging shut. I lunged for it, but it slammed closed with a deafening clang that echoed through the room. I pounded on it with my fists, shouting until my voice went raw, but no one answered. Behind me, I heard the soft scrape of footsteps on concrete, slow and deliberate. I turned and saw the faint outline of someone standing just beyond the edge of the flickering light. They didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. My heart hammered as I pressed myself against the cold metal door, unable to look away. The bulb above me flickered once more and then went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Story 2. The trail to the old ranger station was longer than I remembered. Years ago, when it was still in use, the place had felt more alive, easier to reach. Now the path was overgrown, roots and rocks jutting out like reminders of how long it had been since anyone came this way. I had to push through thick brush near the end, and by the time I reached the clearing, my legs were scratched and sore. The station stood crooked against the backdrop of pines. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the wood siding had gone soft and gray. Its windows were smudged with grime, and one shutter hung by a single hinge, tapping lightly in the breeze. It looked like a place that had been left to rot, but I felt drawn to it, like something inside was waiting. I stepped up onto the warped boards of the porch. The front door creaked when I pushed it open, but it wasn't locked. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of old wood. Sunlight filtered through cracks in the walls and broken blinds, casting thin beams that made the place feel hollow and still. The main room was small, just a desk, a wooden chair, and shelves that had mostly fallen in on themselves. I ran my hand across the desk's surface, clearing a path through the dust. There was a large ledger sitting there, the old kind with a cracked leather cover and yellowed pages. Its weight felt familiar as I opened it. The entries started in the late 1960s and stretched on through the decades. Names of rangers long gone were signed neatly beside dates and brief notes. Most of them were ordinary weather reports, patrol routes, wildlife sightings. I flipped through page after page, the handwriting growing shakier as the years passed. Then, abruptly, the logs stopped in 1987. The last entry was from a ranger named Willis, who noted his departure for winter and the planned closure of the station. After that, nothing but blank pages. I stared at them for a long moment, feeling the strange quiet of the room settle deeper into my chest. I was about to close the book when I noticed something. A new entry, scrawled a few pages past the last old one. The ink was dark, fresh enough that it hadn't faded yet. The handwriting was different, jagged and uneven, as if whoever wrote it had been in a hurry or nervous. Back again. Nightfall soon. I stared at those words until they blurred in my vision. My fingers traced the letters unconsciously, feeling the indentation where the pen had pressed hard into the page. It was dated just last week. I hadn't seen any signs of life on the trail or around the building. No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing. I closed the ledger and stood, suddenly aware of how quiet it was. Outside the station, the wind had stilled. I crossed to the window and peered out through the streaked glass. The forest beyond the clearing was dense and unmoving, its shadows longer now with the late afternoon light. A part of me wanted to leave right then, but something else held me there, a feeling I couldn't shake. I told myself it was curiosity, but it felt more like dread. I walked through the station, checking each room. The bedroom was empty but for a rusted bed frame and an old footlocker that was locked tight. The tiny kitchen was stripped bare, its cabinets hanging open, hinges squealing when I touched them. The back door was closed, but its handle was cold in a way that made me pull my hand away without thinking. I circled back to the main room and sat in the old chair. My pack leaned against the wall, my flashlight tucked inside along with a knife I brought out of habit. I waited, listening, until the last bit of light slipped away. The woods outside turned black, and the wind came back in slow breaths. I turned on the flashlight and swept its beam across the walls. Nothing moved, but the feeling of being watched settled over me. I kept telling myself it was the isolation, the atmosphere, the old stories I had heard growing up about these woods. But I didn't believe it. Around midnight, I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy, deliberate. I stood, holding the flashlight like a weapon, and waited as the steps reached the door. They stopped, and for a long moment there was nothing but silence between us. Then the handle turned slowly, testing the latch. I had locked it earlier, but the sound of metal scraping against wood made my heart race. I backed away toward the window, unsure if I should hide or run. The door shook once, twice, like someone pushing against it. I whispered to myself that it was the wind, but the wind didn't knock 3 times in slow, measured rhythm. I killed the flashlight and crouched low, listening as the knocking stopped. Footsteps retreated across the porch, slow and steady, then nothing. I stayed there until morning light bled into the sky. When I finally opened the door and stepped onto the porch, there were no footprints. Not in the soft dirt, not on the boards. The woods were quiet, as if the night hadn't happened at all. I left the station behind without looking back. The trail seemed shorter on the way down, though I stopped more than once to listen for movement. The words in that ledger stayed with me long after I returned to town. Back again. Night falls soon. Some nights, when I close my eyes, I hear the footsteps. Other times I dream of that old station, still waiting up there, empty but not alone. I tell myself I won't ever go back, but I know I will. Something is there, and it's waiting for night to fall. Story 3. The house had been on the market for years. An old mansion on the outskirts of town, it sat behind a rusted iron gate, half hidden by overgrown trees. Something about it drew me in, maybe curiosity, maybe the challenge. I scheduled a tour, wanting to see it for myself. The agent met me at the front entrance. She was polite but hurried, her eyes constantly flicking to the house, as if she wanted to be anywhere else. I found it odd but didn't comment. We stepped inside, and immediately the air grew colder. Dust hung thick in the light that streamed through tall, narrow windows. The room smelled of damp wood and something faintly metallic. As we walked, the old floors creaked beneath our feet, echoing through the hollow space. I found myself holding my breath more than once. We moved through rooms filled with old, decaying furniture draped in white sheets. Every corner seemed to hold a shadow, each one waiting to shift when I wasn't looking. There was a strange silence to the place, as if the house itself was listening. I told myself it was just old architecture, but the feeling stayed with me. When we reached the kitchen, the agent hesitated. She gestured toward a doorway that led down to the basement. Her words were clipped, saying I was welcome to explore on my own. I gave her a nod and opened the door, trying to ignore the weight that settled in my chest. The basement steps were narrow, the wood soft with age. Each step groaned as I made my way down, flashlight in hand. The deeper I went, the heavier the air felt, as though I was descending into something that hadn't been disturbed for years. I reached the bottom and swept the light across the room. The basement was unfinished, dirt floor beneath my boots and stone walls lined with old shelves. Broken furniture and rotted boxes were pushed against one side. At first glance it seemed empty, but in the middle of the room was a large sheet of plywood laid flat on the ground. Something about it felt wrong. I walked over, feeling the cold rise through the soles of my shoes as I stood above it. My fingers found the edge of the plywood, rough and splintered. I hesitated, then lifted it slowly. Beneath was a square opening cut into the dirt, a ladder descending into darkness. The air that came up from below was colder still. I hesitated, wondering if I should call out for the agent, but my curiosity pulled harder. Gripping the flashlight tighter, I stepped onto the ladder and climbed down carefully. The wood creaked but held. I reached the bottom and found myself in a small, narrow room. The walls were rough dirt, supported by old beams that looked ready to collapse. My flashlight beam trembled slightly as I aimed it around. That's when I saw them. Bones. Piles of them, scattered in heaps along the edges of the room. Some were clean, white and brittle with age, while others were darkened and cracked. Among them were objects: a rusted wristwatch, an old shoe, broken glasses. Personal belongings left to rot with the remains. My breath caught in my throat. I forced myself to take a few steps forward, though my legs felt unsteady. There was something about the way the bones were arranged, as if they had been placed carefully, intentionally. I found a small locket half buried in the dirt, its chain twisted through a cracked skull. A chill worked its way up my spine. I wanted to leave, but my legs wouldn't move fast enough. I kept looking, as if I couldn't stop. In the far corner, a faded leather wallet lay open, the ID inside barely legible. The name didn't matter, but the date of birth caught me. They'd been young. I turned back toward the ladder, heart pounding louder than my footsteps. As I reached for the rungs, I heard something shift behind me. I froze, the sound of loose dirt falling from the ceiling filling the small space. I didn't wait to see what it was. Climbing up as fast as I could, I ignored the groans of the old ladder. My hands burned from gripping the splintered wood, but I didn't stop until I reached the basement again. I pushed the plywood back into place, my breath coming hard and fast. Upstairs, the agent was nowhere to be found. The house was silent. I moved quickly toward the front door, not bothering to close it behind me as I stepped outside. The air felt lighter, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. I didn't call the police. I didn't tell anyone about what I found. I left town not long after and didn't look back. Sometimes late at night, I dream of that room beneath the house. In those dreams, I'm climbing down the ladder again. Only this time, there's someone else waiting in the darkness, and they're always watching me. Story 4. The old hotel downtown had been condemned for years, its windows boarded up and its doors chained shut. But curiosity has a way of getting the better of me, and that night, I found myself squeezing through a gap in the back fence. The air smelled of dust and mildew, heavy with the weight of years gone by. My flashlight cut through the darkness as I stepped carefully over shattered glass and crumbling plaster. The lobby was frozen in time, the grand chandelier hanging crookedly, half its crystals missing. The faded wallpaper peeled away from the walls, revealing cracked plaster beneath. My footsteps echoed on the warped floorboards, each creak sounding louder in the stillness. I kept moving, past the front desk where an old guest book still sat open, its pages yellowed and brittle. I made my way toward the stairs, avoiding the rusted elevator that hung open like a yawning mouth. Each step groaned beneath my weight as I climbed to the third floor. The hallway stretched out ahead, dim and silent, lined with doors that hung askew or had long since fallen from their hinges. I passed rooms filled with broken furniture, torn drapes fluttering in the breeze that slipped through shattered windows. But at the end of the hall, something caught my eye. Suite 304. The door was shut, the brass handle tarnished but intact. I hesitated for a moment before pressing my hand against the wood. It swung open without resistance, and I stepped inside, expecting the same decay I had seen in the other rooms. Instead, the room was eerily pristine. The bed was neatly made, the blankets smoothed over crisp sheets as if housekeeping had just finished. A silver tray sat on the small table near the window, plates of half-eaten food long rotted and covered in thick layers of mold. The smell was sharp and sickly sweet, and I turned away from it quickly, focusing on the strange warmth that seemed to fill the room. I reached out and touched the TV set across from the bed. The plastic casing was warm, as if it had been on recently. My fingers hovered over the power button before I pressed it, half expecting nothing to happen. But the screen flickered to life, bathing the room in pale light, though there was no image, just static hissing softly through the speakers. A chill crept up my spine. There was no power in the building. I had seen the lines cut outside, wires dangling uselessly from poles. And yet the TV was on, glowing faintly in the gloom. I stepped back, wiping my hand on my jeans, and tried to shake the unease settling in my stomach. I moved toward the bed, staring at the perfectly arranged pillows and blanket. It was too neat, too precise, like someone had just left, or was about to return at any moment. I glanced at the nightstand, and noticed an old-fashioned room service menu propped against the lamp, its pages clean, the ink crisp as though freshly printed. I picked it up and flipped through it, my hands trembling slightly. The items listed were strange things I'd never seen on any menu before. Raw meat still bleeding, bone marrow cracked open and served cold, and something listed only as the offering with no description, priced at nothing. The air felt heavier the longer I stayed. I heard something faint, almost like breathing, though when I held my own breath, it didn't stop. It was slow and steady, as if someone lay just beneath the bed or behind the closet door. I took a step back, careful not to make a sound, my pulse thudding loudly in my ears. I backed toward the door, keeping my eyes on the bed. Then something moved. Just a shift, the blanket rising slightly, like a breath underneath it. I froze, unable to move for several long seconds, waiting to see if it would happen again. And it did, the slow rise and fall of someone or something hidden beneath the covers. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and fled into the hall, my boots slamming against the floorboards as I ran. The walls seemed to close in as I stumbled toward the stairs, too afraid to look back. The sound of something dragging along the floor followed me, a low scraping that grew louder with each step. I didn't stop until I reached the ground floor, my chest burning, legs shaking beneath me. The lobby was darker than before, the air colder. I could hear something faint, like a voice murmuring words I couldn't understand. I didn't want to stay to listen. I forced myself toward the entrance, only to find the door I had used was no longer there. The boards I had pried loose were back in place, nailed tightly shut. My hands shook as I pounded against them, splinters digging into my skin. The wood didn't budge. I turned around, pressing my back against it, breathing hard as I tried to think. The lobby was empty, but it didn't feel empty. I crossed to the front desk, desperate for something, anything that might help. The guest book caught my eye again. I flipped back through the pages, skimming the names until I saw mine written on the last line, the ink still wet. Below it was a message, one I hadn't written. Checked in, never checked out. I dropped the book, stumbling back toward the center of the lobby. The lights flickered overhead, even though the power was dead. I heard footsteps above, slow and deliberate, moving down the stairs toward me. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving me in near darkness, except for the faint glow from the TV still on in Suite 304. I didn't wait. I bolted for a side door I had seen earlier, slamming my shoulder against it until it gave way. I tumbled out into the alley, gasping for air, the cold night wind sharp against my face. I didn't look back. I ran, not stopping until I reached the street and the safety of the streetlights. When I finally turned, the hotel stood silent and dark, just as it had for years. But I knew better now. Something was still inside, waiting for the next person curious enough to go in. Story 5. The farmstead was tucked at the end of a narrow, winding road that seemed to go on forever. The listing described it as peaceful and secluded, perfect for a quiet weekend away from the city. The photos showed a cozy, two-story house surrounded by empty fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. I arrived late in the afternoon, the setting sun casting a warm glow over the weathered wood and stone. Inside, the house was simple but charming. There was a faint scent of old pine and something else I couldn't quite place. Dust motes floated in the beams of light that filtered through the curtains. The floors creaked softly with every step, but I told myself that was part of the charm. I unpacked and settled into the small bedroom on the second floor. The bed was low to the ground, the frame old but sturdy, and the thick quilt smelled faintly of lavender. I opened the window to let in some fresh air, but the fields outside were still and silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. It was strange, but I convinced myself it was just how it was out here. Later that evening, I found the journal. It was tucked beneath the bed, its leather cover cracked with age. At first, I thought it was something left behind by accident, but when I flipped through the pages, I saw it had been deliberately placed. Page after page was filled with handwritten entries from people who had stayed here before me. The entries started out normal enough. Each guest described the beauty of the farm, the quiet, and how peaceful everything seemed at first. But after a few pages, a pattern emerged. They all mentioned hearing things at night, soft footsteps on the stairs, whispering from somewhere down the hall, tapping on the windows. I kept reading, curiosity and unease growing with every word. One guest wrote about how they heard someone breathing just outside their door in the middle of the night. Another described waking up to find muddy footprints leading from the front door to their bed and then back out again. Some of them even wrote that they saw figures standing in the fields, watching the house. Each entry ended the same way. They all wrote the same sentence at the bottom of their final page. They came for me. Sometimes it was scrawled hastily, other times written with slow, deliberate strokes. But it was always there. I closed the journal and placed it on the nightstand, staring at it for a long time. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, to tell myself it was just a joke. Maybe it was something previous guests had cooked up to mess with people. But another part of me, the deeper, quieter part, wasn't so sure. That night the house was too quiet. I lay in bed, listening to the stillness pressing around me. Every creak of the wood, every soft groan of the old house made my heart race. Around midnight, I thought I heard something outside, a soft scrape like shoes on gravel. I got up and looked out the window, but the yard was empty. The fields were dark, no moonlight, just an endless black expanse. I stood there for a while, squinting into the darkness, trying to convince myself I hadn't heard anything. Eventually, I closed the window and got back into bed. Sleep didn't come easily. I kept waking up, certain I'd heard something moving downstairs. Once I thought I heard the faint sound of whispering, but when I held my breath and listened, it was gone. I told myself it was the wind, even though there hadn't been any wind earlier. By morning I was exhausted but relieved to see the sun. I made coffee in the small kitchen and sat on the back porch for a while, trying to convince myself it had all been in my head. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The silence in the fields felt heavy, almost like it was waiting. I went back inside and decided to explore the house more, thinking it might help settle my nerves. I checked the closets, the attic, even under the stairs. There was nothing unusual, nothing out of place. But when I walked past the bedroom again, I noticed the journal was open on the bed. I was sure I'd closed it the night before. I picked it up and flipped to the last page. My breath caught in my throat when I saw the new entry. It was written in handwriting that wasn't mine. "They are closer now." I slammed the book shut and backed away from the bed. My pulse thundered in my ears as I tried to think. Part of me wanted to run to the car and leave, but another part of me was frozen. I stood there for what felt like a long time, listening to the house. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the porch outside. The sound of the door handle turning, even though I knew I had locked it. I ran to the window and looked out, but there was no one there. The fields were still empty, but I could feel something watching me. I grabbed my bag and bolted down the stairs, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the front door lock. It wouldn't turn at first, as if someone was holding it from the other side. I finally got it open and ran to my car, not daring to look back. As I drove away, I glanced at the rearview mirror. The house stood silently in the distance, but I could see figures in the fields now. They were standing in a wide circle around the house, unmoving, watching. I didn't stop driving until I reached the highway. I never went back for the refund or left a review. Every now and then I wonder about that journal and who might have found it next. And sometimes late at night I still hear footsteps outside my window. Story 6. The camp had been abandoned for years, maybe decades, but curiosity got the better of me. I had heard stories about Camp Hollow Pines, whispers of why it had closed down, but nothing concrete. The place wasn't hard to find, tucked back in the woods where the trees grew thick and tangled. I parked a short walk away and followed the overgrown path until the buildings came into view. The cabins stood in sagging lines, their roofs caved in, walls leaning at odd angles. Moss coated the wood, and some windows gaped open like hollow eyes. The air smelled damp and stale, carrying a faint sweetness that made my stomach turn. I stepped carefully, mindful of where I placed my feet as the old boards creaked under my weight. Most of the cabins were empty, littered with broken furniture and forgotten belongings. Tattered curtains hung in shreds and old mattresses lay stripped and stained on the floors. I took my time moving from one structure to the next, occasionally snapping a photo or lifting something to inspect. The deeper into the camp I went, the quieter it became, as if even the birds avoided this place. One cabin near the back caught my eye. Unlike the others, its door was still closed, hanging straight on its hinges. The paint was mostly gone, and a large crack ran down the center, but something about it felt different. I gave the door a gentle push, and it swung open with a low groan. Dust swirled in the air, disturbed by the sudden movement. Inside, it was darker than the others. The windows had been boarded from the inside, letting only thin slivers of light sneak through the gaps. As my eyes adjusted, I noticed the bunk beds lining each side of the room. They were intact, neatly arranged, and each had clean sheets tucked tightly at the corners. The sheets were white, crisp, and free of dust, as if someone had made the beds just that morning. A faint smell of detergent hung in the air, too fresh for a place like this. I stood there for a moment, listening for any sound that might explain it, but all I heard was the soft hum of my own breathing. Something about it made me uneasy, but I stepped further inside anyway. Near the back of the cabin was a small wooden table. It held a single item, a notebook, its black cover worn smooth at the edges. I approached slowly, reaching out to flip it open. The pages were yellowed but neatly filled with names, each one written in tidy, uniform handwriting. Beside each name was a small box. Some of the boxes had check marks in them, clean and precise. Others were left blank. I scanned the list looking for anything familiar, but the names meant nothing to me. They didn't seem like campers' names either, no last names, no other details, just a first name in that little box. I turned a few more pages, finding more lists in the same style. As I did, the hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and I glanced behind me. The cabin was still empty. The bed still sat neatly in place, undisturbed, but I had the strange feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I forced myself to focus on the notebook again. Towards the middle, one page had a different kind of note scribbled beneath a name. It was smaller, written in tighter letters, but I could make out the words if I leaned in closer. It read, "Taken during quiet hour." My pulse quickened, and I snapped the book shut without thinking. My fingers trembled as I held the notebook. I wasn't sure why, but something about it made me feel like I needed to leave. I stepped away from the table and made my way back toward the door. Before I could reach it, I heard the faint sound of something shifting behind me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Slowly I turned my head to look over my shoulder. One of the bunk beds, one that had been perfectly still a moment ago, now had a shape beneath its sheet. It hadn't been there before. The sheet rose slightly and then sank, as if someone was breathing underneath. I took a step backward, bumping into the door frame. My fingers found the handle, and I yanked the door open as quickly as I could. The sudden rush of daylight blinded me for a second, but I didn't hesitate. I ran. The path back to my car felt twice as long as before. Branches clawed at my arms and the underbrush seemed thicker, but I didn't stop moving. My heart pounded in my chest, and I glanced over my shoulder more than once, half expecting to see someone or something chasing me. When I reached the car, I threw the door open and jumped inside. I locked the doors and sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath. The notebook still rested on the passenger seat where I dropped it. I stared at it, wondering if I should take it with me or leave it behind. After a moment, I picked it up and shoved it into my backpack. I didn't know why I couldn't leave it there. Maybe I thought I could make sense of it later. Maybe I was just afraid it would end up back in my hands somehow if I didn't. Driving away from Camp Hollow Pines, I felt a little lighter with each mile I put between me and that place. But that night, when I opened the notebook again, something was different. There was a new name written on the last page. My name. And the box next to it was empty. Story 7. It was nearly midnight when I pulled off the highway, running on fumes and nerves. The only sign of life for miles was a flickering neon light above a small, rundown gas station. The kind of place that seemed forgotten, with cracked pavement and weeds growing through the concrete. I parked next to the pump and killed the engine, listening to it tick as it cooled in the night air. The pumps were old, their digital displays dim but still cycling numbers as if someone had just used them. I stepped out of the car and glanced toward the small booth by the door, expecting to see an attendant inside. It was empty. The chair sat pushed back, the door slightly ajar, swaying gently on its hinges. I stood there for a minute, debating whether to leave and risk running out of gas down the road or stay and figure things out. The quiet was unsettling. No bugs, no breeze, just a heavy stillness. Curiosity got the better of me, and I walked toward the booth. Inside, it was cleaner than I expected. A faded map hung on the wall, and a small stack of receipts was neatly organized on the counter. What caught my attention, though, was a wallet sitting in the middle of the desk. It looked old, the leather cracked and worn at the edges like it had been handled many times. I picked it up and flipped it open. There was an ID inside, behind the plastic window. The name was familiar, though I couldn't place where I had heard it before. The photo showed a man in his late 30s with dark hair and a tired smile. Then it hit me. I'd seen his face on a missing persons flyer years ago, pinned up on a bulletin board in a diner off another highway. His name had stuck with me because of how long he'd been gone. 5 years, maybe more. No one had ever found him. I set the wallet back down, but a chill ran through me. I glanced over my shoulder at the empty lot. My car sat alone by the pumps, and beyond that, only darkness stretched out in every direction. There were no other cars, no one walking around. The sound caught my ear, something faint, almost like a shuffle on gravel. I turned back to the booth window, scanning the area. Nothing moved. The pumps kept running, the numbers on the display ticking higher, though no one stood there fueling a car. I stepped back outside and walked toward the pump closest to my car. The nozzle was resting in its holder, but the screen showed someone had purchased several gallons of gas recently. The handle was cold to the touch, though the numbers kept climbing as if it were still in use. A growing sense of unease twisted in my gut. I reached into my pocket for my phone, but there was no signal. Just a dead gray bar that told me I was well out of range of anything. I thought about getting back in the car and leaving, but something told me to take another look inside the station first. The door to the small building creaked as I pushed it open. The place smelled faintly of gasoline and dust. Rows of shelves sat half empty, stocked with old snacks and bottled water that looked like it had been there for years. A faint buzzing sound came from one of the overhead lights, flickering weakly in the gloom. Behind the counter, I found a small logbook. The pages were yellowed and brittle at the edges. Names and times were written in neat handwriting, noting gas purchases and cash payments. The last entry was dated 3 years ago. After that, the pages were blank. I felt a sudden draft against the back of my neck, cold enough to make me shiver. I turned sharply, expecting someone to be standing behind me, but no one was there. The door I'd come through was still open, though it now swayed like someone had just passed through it. I took a steadying breath and walked quickly back toward the booth. The wallet was still sitting there where I'd left it, but now it was open, and the ID was gone. I hadn't touched it after setting it back down. My fingers tingled as I picked it up again, checking the other compartments. Empty. Key. I backed away from the booth, my heart pounding hard enough to hear it in my ears. The feeling of being watched was sudden and overwhelming. I scanned the lot again but saw nothing. The pumps were still running, though the numbers now flashed an error message I couldn't make sense of. Getting back into my car felt like the only smart choice. I hurried over, yanking open the door and slamming it behind me. I turned the key, praying the engine would start without stalling. It coughed once but then roared to life. Relief washed over me for a brief second. I grabbed the steering wheel and put the car in drive, glancing once more at the booth as I prepared to pull away. The chair inside was no longer empty. Someone was sitting there now, their face hidden in shadow, but I knew they were watching me. The cold stare was unmistakable even from a distance. I didn't wait. I hit the gas and sped out of the lot, tires skidding on the cracked pavement. In the rearview mirror, the gas station disappeared into the darkness, as if it had never been there at all. The neon sign flickered one last time and then went dark completely. My hands were shaking as I drove, the highway stretching out endlessly ahead. I didn't stop again until the sun rose. When I finally found a town with a police station, I tried to explain what I'd seen. They told me that station had been closed for years. Burned down in a fire, they said. No one had worked there since. They didn't believe me when I told them about the wallet. They didn't want to hear about the missing man's ID or the booth that was empty, then wasn't. But I still have the wallet. It's in my glove compartment now. And every time I check it, the ID is gone. Story 8. The hotel had been a grand place once. Its wide marble steps were cracked, the iron railings rusted, but you could still see the shape of what it had been. They were renovating it into something modern, something sleek, but the bones of the old building remained. I'd always been drawn to places like that, history trapped behind walls and beneath floorboards. I had a chance to walk through it before the real work began. The ground floors were stripped bare, plastic sheeting covering empty doorways and loose wires hanging from the ceilings. It was quiet in a way that made you feel like you weren't supposed to be there. My boots echoed through the empty halls as I made my way toward the upper floors. A man working on the second floor told me not to bother going to the top, said it was unstable up there. But his tone had something else in it, something I recognized but didn't want to name. I nodded, thanked him, and when he turned back to his work, I headed for the stairs. The climb was long, each step creaking under my weight. Dust floated in thick beams of light cutting through the broken windows. The air grew heavier the higher I went, like something pressing against me. By the time I reached the top floor, my mouth was dry. The hallway stretched in both directions, faded carpet peeled up at the edges. Doors lined each side, their numbers long since worn away. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, until I saw the first set of claw marks. They were faint at first, just light scratches around the doorknob of room 801. At first I thought it was damage from years of neglect, maybe animals getting inside. But then I saw them again on 802. This time deeper, carved into the wood like something had been trying to get out. The next door was worse, and the one after that even more so. Some of the knobs were loose, as if twisted hard from the inside. I kept walking, running my hand lightly over each scarred surface. It wasn't until I reached the end of the hall that I noticed the door. Room 817. Unlike the others, this one had a deadbolt, but it was on the outside. I stared at it for a long time. The bolt was thick, rusted in place. I touched it carefully, half expecting it to burn. It didn't, but there was something about the coldness of the metal that made my skin crawl. The claw marks around this door were the worst yet. Deep gouges in the frame, long and jagged, as though something had raked at it for hours, maybe days. The knob itself was bent at an angle, the metal warped like it had been twisted with impossible strength. I didn't open the door. I don't think I could have even if I wanted to. It felt wrong just standing there, like the air in front of it was thicker than the rest of the hallway. I backed away slowly, my heartbeat hammering in my chest. As I moved, I realized something else. All the other doors on this floor, every single one opened inward. But room 817's door opened out. The hinges were on the wrong side, as though it had been meant to keep something inside rather than out. I turned back toward the stairs, every instinct telling me to leave. But halfway down the hall, I heard something. A sound faint but clear, scratching, slow and steady as if nails were dragging across wood. I froze, holding my breath, listening. It came again, then again from behind one of the doors. I didn't wait to find out which one. I walked fast, not quite running, trying to stay quiet even though every step echoed louder than I wanted. When I reached the stairwell, I didn't stop. I went down fast, skipping steps when I could, gripping the railing so tight my hand ached. The lower I got, the less heavy the air felt, but my skin was still cold with something like fear. I passed the man I'd seen earlier. He didn't look at me, just kept working, hammering something into the wall. His movements were slow, like he'd been doing it for years. I wanted to ask him about the doors upstairs, about the scratches and the locks. But I didn't. I walked past him and kept going until I was outside. The sun was still up, but it didn't make me feel any warmer. I stood there for a while, looking up at the top floor windows. Most of them were boarded up, but one was open. Room 817. I was sure of it. I stared at that dark square until my eyes watered. There was nothing there, just the empty space. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching back, waiting. I didn't go back inside after that. Not that day, not ever. But I thought about it often. I thought about the scratches, the warped knobs, the bolt. The door that opened out. The sound of something waiting, dragging its claws along the inside of the door frame. The hotel eventually reopened. They turned it into a modern space, full of glass and light. People paid good money to stay there now, but I never did. I couldn't. Sometimes when I pass by at night, I see lights on in the windows, on the top floor, just a faint glow behind those glass panes. And sometimes if I watch long enough, I swear I can see a shadow move, right behind the glass, right where room 817 would be. Story 9. I had always been drawn to abandoned places. There was something about forgotten buildings and empty halls that stirred my curiosity in ways I couldn't explain. When I heard about the decommissioned psychiatric asylum on the edge of town, I knew I had to see it for myself. It had been closed for over 30 years, and stories about it had turned into little more than rumors and half-truths. The entrance was easier to find than I thought it would be. The front gate hung lopsided on broken hinges, swinging with every breeze. I stepped through, boots crunching over gravel and weeds pushing up through cracked concrete. The building loomed ahead, windows shattered and gaping like open mouths. Inside, the air smelled stale and heavy, thick with dust and decay. The halls were lined with peeling paint and broken furniture, a ghost of what the place had once been. I walked slowly, shining my flashlight into dark corners and doorways. Each room told its own story, most of them quiet, long forgotten. I reached the second floor, where most of the patient rooms were located. Some of them were open, revealing nothing but bare beds and discarded medical equipment. Others were locked tight, their doors scratched and scuffed. I paused in front of one, noticing how deep the gouges were, as if someone had clawed at it for hours. Further down the hall, I found a padded room. The thick door was already ajar, creaking as I pushed it open. The walls were covered in faded, grimy padding torn in several places, but it was what was beneath the padding that made me stop cold. Long, deep scratch marks ran across the walls, cutting through the padding like it wasn't even there. They were ragged and erratic, as if whoever made them had been frantic, desperate. My stomach turned as I imagined the person responsible, trapped inside and clawing at the walls in silence. Then I saw it, resting in the corner of the room. A camcorder, old but surprisingly intact, sat atop a pile of shredded padding. Its red recording light was still on, a faint glow in the dim room. I picked it up carefully, unsure if it would even work after all these years. I checked the screen. To my surprise, there was footage 6 hours worth, according to the counter. I sat down on the floor just outside the door, leaning against the cool concrete, and pressed play. At first, there was nothing. Just a still shot of the room. The door closed, no sound at all. I watched for several minutes, waiting for something to happen. The footage didn't move, not even a flicker. No one entered the room. No one left. It was as if the camera had been set up to watch an empty space, and that was all it had caught. But around the 2-hour mark, something changed. The padding on the far wall seemed to shift slightly, as if something was pressing out from behind it. I squinted at the screen, wondering if it was just my imagination. Then the padding tore, a jagged split opening along the seam. Nothing came out, but the camera's microphone picked up something faint. A scratching sound, slow and steady, like nails dragging along fabric. It grew louder over the next hour, though nothing was visible in the footage except the torn padding. By hour 4, the scratching stopped. Silence filled the speakers, but it wasn't comforting. It felt heavy, suffocating. And then the door in the footage began to rattle, gently at first, then harder, shaking in its frame. I glanced up at the real door in front of me, suddenly uneasy. I kept watching. The door on the video never opened, but the rattling stopped as quickly as it had started. For the last 2 hours of the footage, there was nothing. The camera remained pointed at the torn padding. No movement, no sound. I rewound the footage, scanning back to the moment the wall had shifted. Watching it again didn't make it any clearer. I couldn't tell if something was trying to get out or trying to get in. The scratches in the real wall looked fresh, despite the asylum being abandoned for decades. The battery indicator on the camcorder was nearly dead. I turned it off, my fingers trembling slightly as I placed it back where I had found it. A sudden cold draft passed through the doorway, raising goosebumps on my arms. I stood slowly, shining my flashlight over the room one more time. Something about it didn't feel right anymore. I had been in plenty of abandoned places, but this was different. It was as if the air itself was heavier here, thick with something I couldn't see but could feel pressing down on me. I backed out of the room and closed the door. The old metal latch clicked into place, though I knew it wouldn't keep anything in or out. As I turned to leave, I thought I heard the faintest sound of scratching, starting again behind the padded walls. I walked faster on my way back through the asylum. My flashlight flickered once, but I didn't stop to check it. Every sound echoed down the empty corridors, and I found myself glancing behind me more than once. The silence felt watchful now, and I was no longer curious. When I stepped back outside, the sky had grown darker than I expected. I didn't look back as I crossed the cracked pavement and made my way to the gate. The wind picked up as I left, the broken hinge creaking behind me until I was too far away to hear it. I still have no explanation for what I saw on that camcorder. Sometimes I wonder if I should have taken it with me, but a part of me is glad I didn't. Whatever was in that room, it wasn't something I wanted to bring back into the world. Even now, I sometimes hear scratching in the quiet of my apartment at night. Soft at first, barely noticeable, but it always grows louder if I listen too long. I don't think it ever really stayed behind. Story 10. The theater had been closed for years. Its windows were boarded up, the marquee long since dark, and vines curled their way up the brick facade like fingers trying to hold it together. People in town said it shut down overnight after something happened during a late screening. I didn't believe in stories like that, but when I finally worked up the nerve to slip through a broken side door, it felt like I was walking into something that hadn't been meant to be disturbed. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint smell of mildew. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, illuminating rows of decayed seats and torn curtains. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional creak of old wood beneath my feet. I moved slowly, my footsteps echoing as I made my way up toward the projection booth. The door to the booth was cracked open. Light flickered from inside, casting faint movements on the wall opposite the door. I hesitated, feeling the weight of something cold settle into my stomach, but curiosity pressed me forward. The door gave way with a soft groan as I stepped through. The room was small, cluttered with old reels stacked haphazardly against the walls. A projector stood in the center, running on its own, its reels spinning smoothly despite the dust that coated everything else. The film it played was cast onto a tattered sheet hung against the far wall. I found myself moving closer, squinting at the grainy images flickering in the dim light. At first, I thought it was some old home movie. The camera was shaky, its focus uncertain, but then I noticed the people. They were seated in chairs, each of them bound at the wrists and ankles. Their mouths were gagged, and their faces were pale, their eyes wide, and staring at something in front of them, something just beyond the edge of the frame. I could hear the faint sound of the film's audio through the projector's speakers. It wasn't dialogue. It was a low, rhythmic hum, almost like breathing, slow and steady, growing louder as the reel continued. None of the people on the film moved, except for the slight shudder of their bodies, as though they were trying not to scream. I stepped back, my foot knocking against something on the floor. Glancing down, I saw another reel, its label faded but marked with a date. I picked it up without thinking, dust puffing into the air as I did. There were dozens of them, more than I could count, each labeled with a different date, some going back decades. The projector clicked loudly as the reel ran out. The screen went white for a moment before another reel loaded itself without me touching anything. My throat felt dry as I watched the next film begin. A different group of people this time, but they were tied the same way, sitting in the same chairs, staring at the same unseen thing. The sound returned, deeper this time, the hum replaced by something closer to a growl. I backed toward the door, but when I tried the handle, it wouldn't budge. I jiggled it harder, feeling a rising panic, but it stayed stuck in place. Turning back, I found the projector still running, the images continuing as though I had never moved. There was something unnatural about how smoothly it ran, something wrong in the way it whirred. As I watched, one of the figures on the screen turned its head slightly, as if looking toward the camera. Their eyes met mine, unblinking, hollow, as if they saw me through the screen. I stumbled back, pressing myself against the door, my breath quick and shallow. The film crackled, and the picture jumped as more figures appeared behind the chairs, standing perfectly still. The film flickered again. The figures behind the chairs began to lean forward, their faces never quite clear, always obscured by static or shadows. They raised their arms and pointed toward the unseen thing, guiding the gaze of those bound. One of the seated people began to thrash violently, the chair rocking as they struggled, but the ropes held tight. I turned back to the reels on the floor, noticing now that some of them had labels with names instead of dates. Some of those names were familiar people I knew had gone missing over the years. My stomach turned as I realized their faces matched some of the people on the screen. I dropped the reel I was holding, the sound of it clattering on the floor unnaturally loud. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, my breath clouding the air in front of me. The projector's hum deepened into a low, pulsing throb that made my ears ache. I could feel the vibration in my chest, as if the sound was pulling something out of me. On the screen, the seated people sagged in their chairs, their bodies slack as though drained of whatever had kept them alive. I pounded on the door with my fists, the wood rattling but refusing to give. The reels on the shelves began to shake, some of them tumbling down with soft thuds. The figures on the screen moved again, all of them turning toward me this time, their mouths opening in wide, silent screams. The hum became a shriek, sharp and endless, drilling into my skull. Without thinking, I grabbed a nearby metal chair and hurled it at the projector. It struck the machine with a crash, knocking it sideways. The film tore from the reel, the light sputtered, and the room plunged into darkness. I stood there, frozen, waiting for anything to happen. Slowly, the door creaked open behind me. I didn't waste time thinking about it. I ran down the narrow stairs through the decaying theater, past rows of seats that seemed to twist and lean toward me. I didn't stop until I was back outside, gulping fresh air, the boarded door slamming shut behind me on its own. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. I didn't want to explain the reels still spinning in my head, or the faces I still see in my dreams. I know they're still there, in that room, watching something none of us should ever see. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear that projector running again. Story 11. The inn was charming in the way old places usually are: creaky wood floors, faded wallpaper, and the faint scent of something you can't quite place. It sat on the edge of a small town where stories passed through more often than travelers. The owner, a thin, quiet man, handed me an actual metal key and said breakfast was served at dawn. He didn't say much else, but he watched me with an odd intensity as I climbed the stairs to my room. The hallway stretched long and narrow, dimly lit by old sconces that flickered with a soft yellow light. Each door I passed had a heavy iron lock fixed to the outside, as if they were meant to keep something in rather than out. My room was the last one at the end of the hall. The key stuck a little in the lock before turning with a dry scrape, and when I pushed open the door, it groaned like it hadn't moved in years. Inside, the room was clean but plain white sheets on an iron bed frame, a worn armchair in the corner, and a dresser that smelled faintly of mothballs. The window overlooked a darkened street below, though the curtains were too thick to see much once they were drawn. I set down my bag and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the steady ticking of the old clock on the wall. For a while, the quiet felt peaceful. As I unpacked, I noticed something strange. The door lock, the one on the inside, wasn't a normal deadbolt. It was a sliding latch that could only be secured from my side. But the heavier lock, the one bolted to the door frame, was on the outside. It struck me as odd, but I told myself it was probably just a relic from when the place had different uses. Maybe it had been a hospital or a boarding school once. Old buildings wore their histories like scars. I tried to brush it off, but the longer I sat there, the more it nagged at me. At dinner, I asked the owner casually about the locks. He gave a thin smile and said it was for the guests' privacy. His answer was simple, but the way he said it felt rehearsed. I didn't press him. Something told me not to. That night, I tried to sleep, but every creak in the floorboards outside made my skin prickle. Around midnight, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate steps that stopped and started again in front of different doors. I lay still in bed, holding my breath, listening as they made their way closer to my room. Then they stopped just outside. I heard the faint sound of metal scraping against metal, like someone testing the lock. I sat up quietly and stared at the door, heart pounding in my ears. The latch was still fastened on my side. I told myself I was safe, but the doorknob gave a slow turn, as if someone on the other side was trying it. Except the knob didn't move the way it should have. It turned, but it wasn't being twisted from the hallway. It moved from inside my room. I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the mattress, too scared to make a sound. The knob turned halfway, then clicked back into place. Then it started turning again, slower this time, almost like whoever or whatever was doing it was trying to be careful. I slid quietly out of bed, my feet cold on the floor. I crossed the room and picked up my phone from the nightstand. No signal. The bars were dead, even though I'd had reception earlier in the day. I glanced toward the window, thinking about climbing out, but I was 2 stories up and the drop didn't look forgiving. The knob turned again, and this time it felt deliberate, like it was trying to open, but the latch was holding it closed. I backed away from the door, my pulse racing. The noise stopped. For a long time there was silence. I stood there, breathing shallowly, waiting for something else to happen. Then I heard the sound of fingernails tapping on the wood, slow, steady taps, just on the other side of the door. I stepped back farther until I hit the wall behind me. The tapping continued for what felt like minutes before it stopped abruptly. I didn't dare move. I watched the door, half expecting it to burst open, but it didn't. At some point I must have slid down the wall because I found myself sitting on the floor, knees pulled up to my chest. I stared at the door for the rest of the night. The footsteps eventually returned, moving away down the hall until I couldn't hear them anymore. But I didn't close my eyes. Not once. When morning came, the first light crept in around the heavy curtains. I stood slowly, legs stiff from sitting so long. I walked to the door and checked the latch. It was still in place. The knob was still. But when I opened the door, there were fresh scratches along the inside edge of the frame. They hadn't been there before. The hallway was empty. The locks on the other doors glinted dully in the morning light. I left my bag behind and walked downstairs. The owner was waiting behind the front desk, hands folded neatly on the counter. He smiled that same thin smile and asked if I had slept well. I lied and said I had. I handed him the key, and he took it slowly, his fingers brushing mine a little too long. He said I was welcome to stay again anytime. I nodded and walked out into the bright morning, feeling the weight of his eyes on my back the entire time. I didn't look back. It wasn't until I was halfway down the road, driving toward the highway, that I noticed something in my rearview mirror. For just a moment, I thought I saw someone standing in one of the upstairs windows, watching. I kept driving, faster now, gripping the wheel tighter than I needed to. I never told anyone about that night, but sometimes when I stay in a hotel or a rental, I still check the locks. I make sure they're only on my side, and if I hear footsteps in the hallway, I never open the door. Story 12. The old public school had been abandoned for nearly 20 years. Its brick exterior was cracked and weather-stained, with vines crawling up the walls like veins. Windows were broken or boarded up, and graffiti covered most of the lower floors. Despite its condition, the building still had a strange pull, like something inside was waiting to be found. I arrived in the late afternoon, when the sun was low enough to cast long shadows through the empty lot. My boots crunched over broken glass and debris as I made my way toward the entrance. The door hung open on rusted hinges, creaking slightly when I pushed it wider. The smell inside was thick with mildew, damp wood, and something older that I couldn't quite place. I carried a flashlight in one hand. The light still streamed through gaps in the windows. The main hallway stretched ahead, lockers lining both sides. Most were dented or hanging open, their contents long gone. My footsteps echoed as I walked, each sound sharp in the otherwise heavy silence. I had heard stories about this place growing up. Some people said it was haunted, others that strange things had happened there even before it closed down. I didn't put much stock in ghost stories, but curiosity had a way of pushing me into places I probably shouldn't have gone. This school was being demolished soon, and I figured it was my last chance to see inside. The first few classrooms I checked were empty. Desks were overturned, papers were strewn across the floors, and chalk dust coated every surface. Graffiti covered the walls, messages and drawings left by people who had been here before me. None of it felt unusual, just the decay of an old, forgotten building. Then I found the room on the third floor. The door was closed, but not locked. The wood was smooth and cold beneath my hand as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was still, heavier somehow than in the rest of the school. Dust hung thick, swirling in the beam of my flashlight. The desks were arranged in perfect rows. Each one was pushed close to the next, the chairs tucked in neatly. They all faced the blackboard at the front of the room. It was the only classroom where nothing seemed disturbed, like it had been left untouched for years. What made me stop was the writing on the blackboard. Scrawled in thick, uneven letters was a message that seemed to press into the room like a weight. Don't move. I stood there for a long time, just looking at it. The words were harsh, as if someone had carved them into the surface with urgency or anger. The chalk had crumbled in places, leaving faint streaks beneath the message. It looked fresh compared to everything else in the room. I stepped inside, my boots scraping softly against the dusty floor. The sound seemed too loud, and for a moment I hesitated. The air in the room felt different, cooler and tense. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though I knew I was alone. Each desk was exactly the same. Clean surfaces, no papers or books, no signs of anyone having used them recently. But the chairs, there was something about the way they were positioned that made my skin crawl. Perfectly aligned, perfectly still. It was unnatural in a place so abandoned. I walked slowly toward the blackboard, the words seeming to loom larger the closer I got. I half expected to find someone hiding behind the teacher's desk, but there was nothing there. Just dust, an old mug tipped over on its side, and an empty chair pushed slightly away from the desk. I reached out and touched the writing on the blackboard. The chalk came away easily on my fingertips, dry and brittle. It didn't feel recent, but something about it still seemed wrong. I turned back to the room, staring at the rows of desks and the chairs waiting silently. I took another step forward, then stopped. There was a sound behind me, faint but clear, a soft scrape like wood moving across the floor. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly turned around. One of the chairs was no longer tucked in. It had slid back, maybe a foot or two, enough that I knew it hadn't been like that when I first walked in. I stared at it, waiting for some logical explanation to come to mind. Maybe the floor was uneven, maybe I had bumped into it without realizing, but I hadn't been anywhere near that desk. I backed away toward the door, keeping my eyes on the room. Another sound followed. Another chair sliding back slowly, legs dragging softly against the floor. Then another, and another. The sound was quiet, but it was everywhere now, as more chairs moved without anyone sitting in them. My chest tightened as I realized they were all turning. Each chair was twisting slightly away from the blackboard. They were turning to face me. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. I caught myself on the doorframe, my hands slick with sweat. The desks stayed in their neat rows, but the chairs continued to shift, slow and deliberate, until they were all facing me directly. For a moment, nothing happened. The room was dead silent again. Then I heard something faint, like whispers at the very edge of hearing. I couldn't make out the words, but they were coming from everywhere, soft and breathy, growing louder by the second. I stepped back into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind me. The handle was cold under my grip, but I forced it to turn and lock. My pulse pounded in my ears as I backed away, staring at the door like something might burst through it at any moment. The whispers stopped. The hallway was silent again. I didn't stay to find out if anything else would happen. I hurried back down the stairs, barely watching where I stepped. The building seemed darker now, every shadow deeper than before. By the time I reached the exit, my hands were shaking. Outside, the late afternoon light was almost blinding. I didn't stop walking until I was halfway across the lot. When I finally looked back, the school sat still and quiet. Just another abandoned building waiting to be torn down. I didn't tell anyone what I saw in that room. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it, if the building's atmosphere had gotten to me more than I realized. But I can still hear those chairs scraping across the floor in my head, and I will never forget the message on the board. Don't move. Story 13. The church stood at the edge of town, long abandoned and slowly falling apart. Its wooden doors hung loosely on rusted hinges, and the stained glass windows were cracked and clouded with dust. I had driven past it dozens of times, each glance pulling at my curiosity a little more. One evening, just before sunset, I decided to explore it. Pushing open the door was harder than I expected. It scraped across the warped floorboards with a groan that echoed through the hollow space. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and mold. The pews were splintered and broken, scattered haphazardly as though a storm had torn through. I walked slowly down the central aisle, each step sending up small clouds of dust. The light filtering through the cracked windows painted faint colors on the floor, though most of it was swallowed by the darkness inside. Ahead of me stood the altar, simple and worn, its cloth covering faded to a dull gray. Something about it felt wrong, but I couldn't explain why. Behind the altar, I noticed something odd. There was a section of the wooden floor that didn't quite match the rest, less dust, fewer scratches, almost like it had been used more recently. I knelt down and ran my fingers along the edges until I found a small metal ring. With a deep breath, I pulled it up, revealing a heavy trapdoor. It opened with a slow creak, the hinges stiff but still working. Beneath was a set of narrow stone steps, leading down into darkness. I hesitated at the top, the cold air rising from below making my skin prickle. My flashlight beam flickered for a moment as I clicked it on, but then it steadied, and I started down. The walls closed in as I descended. The stone was damp beneath my fingers, rough and cold to the touch. It felt like I was moving underground, much farther than I should have been. When I finally reached the bottom, I stepped into a chamber I could barely process at first. The room was lined with cages, rusted metal bars, some bent and broken, others still intact. Chains hung from the walls, old leather cuffs attached to their ends. Some of them still had bones inside, thin and brittle, curled up in ways that made my stomach turn. I forced myself to keep looking, even when every part of me screamed to run. Along one of the stone walls, names had been carved deeply into the surface. Next to many of them, the word saved was scratched in crude, uneven letters. There were dozens, maybe hundreds of names. I walked slowly along the wall, reading them one by one. Some names had dates next to them, others didn't. The word saved seemed more like a sentence than a blessing. The names without it stood out even more, as if they had been left behind or forgotten. A sudden noise made me freeze. A faint clinking like metal on stone echoed from the far side of the chamber. My flashlight wavered as I turned toward the sound, the beam catching on another row of cages. One of the doors was slightly ajar, swinging gently as though someone had just touched it. I backed away, my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched was impossible to ignore. My breath was shallow, and the air down there was heavy, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. I didn't want to find out what might be waiting in the shadows. As I turned to leave, my light caught on something carved into the floor near the base of the wall. Another name, freshly cut into the stone. The edges still rough. Underneath it was the word, saved, but it looked newer than the others, as if someone had been there not long ago. The name was unfamiliar, but the date scratched next to it was from last week. I hurried back to the stairs, my footsteps loud against the stone. Halfway up, I heard the sound again, closer this time, followed by what I thought was a low whisper. I didn't stop to listen. I climbed faster, not caring if the old steps held or not. When I reached the trapdoor, I pushed it shut behind me with shaking hands. The church above felt just as empty as before, but it wasn't comforting. I moved quickly toward the entrance, not looking back, and stepped outside into the fading light. The air felt thin and cold against my face. I stood there for a few moments, catching my breath, listening to the quiet around me. No one was there, at least no one I could see. But something told me I wasn't alone. I never went back to that church. Over time, the memory of it settled deep inside me, though I tried not to think about it. Sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night, I wonder how many more names were waiting to be carved on that wall, and whether someone was still down there, waiting to add another. Story 14. The trail I followed wasn't marked on any map. It twisted deep into the forest, through thick trees and overgrown brush that hadn't seen footsteps in years. I didn't plan to wander that far, but something about the quiet drew me in. The deeper I went, the more the world seemed to muffle, like the air itself was holding its breath. I noticed the clearing when the trees thinned, the charred remains of a house rising from the earth like blackened bones. The roof had collapsed inward, and most of the walls were gone, leaving only a skeletal outline of what had once been a home. The air smelled faintly of ash, though the fire had long since burned out. I stepped carefully over the threshold, my boots crunching on brittle wood and broken glass. Inside, everything was coated in soot and dirt. Bits of furniture were still visible, warped and cracked from the heat. A metal bed frame leaned against the wall, its springs twisted and rusted. In one corner, the remains of a staircase led downward into darkness. I hesitated for a long time before moving closer, my curiosity stronger than my fear. The cellar door was warped but still intact. I pulled it open with a sharp creak, revealing stone steps that disappeared into shadows. The air that rose up was colder than the world above, carrying a damp, heavy scent that made me pause. I clicked on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness as I started down. At the bottom of the stairs, the cellar was surprisingly intact. The stone walls were stained with smoke, but they held firm. Shelves lined the room, most of them filled with glass jars of all shapes and sizes. I stepped closer, shining the light on their contents, my stomach turning as I realized what I was seeing. Inside the jars were animals preserved in cloudy liquid, small birds, their feathers dulled, lizards with their eyes milky and white, mice curled into tight balls, floating as if asleep. Some jars were labeled in handwriting that had faded almost entirely away, but others were marked with symbols I didn't recognize. I moved down the row, each jar more disturbing than the last. A cat with its mouth open in a silent scream. A snake coiled tightly around itself, its scales peeling. Then I saw something that made me freeze. One jar, larger than the rest, held something unmistakably human. It was a collection of fingers, pale and bloated, suspended in a murky fluid. Each one was adorned with a ring, some plain bands, others set with stones that caught the beam of my flashlight. They floated slightly apart from each other, as if they had drifted into their positions over time. The sight made my skin crawl. I leaned in closer, trying to make sense of the rings. They were all different styles, some old-fashioned, others more modern. One was a class ring, the inscription too faded to read. Another was a thin gold band, twisted as if bent by force. None of the fingers matched in size or complexion. Whoever they had belonged to, they hadn't come from the same person. My breath fogged the glass as I stared, unable to tear my eyes away. The liquid inside was thick and yellowish, clouded in places. Something about it made me feel sick, like it was wrong in a way I couldn't explain. I took a step back, fighting the urge to run, and scanned the rest of the room. On another shelf was an open book, its pages stained and brittle. Drawings filled the margins, strange diagrams of bodies, animals, and symbols. The language was foreign to me, but I recognized the shapes as ritualistic, their purpose lost but their intent clear. Whoever had lived here had practiced something ancient and dark. I moved toward the far corner of the cellar, where a work table sat against the wall. Rusted tools were scattered across its surface, knives, saws, clamps. The blades were dull, but dark stains marked the wood beneath them. Beside the tools lay a stack of photographs, each one warped from heat and moisture. I picked one up carefully, wiping away grime to see the image. It was a woman standing in the forest, smiling faintly, with something indistinct in her hands. Another showed a man holding a jar, much like the ones on the shelves, staring at the camera with blank eyes. The last photo I touched was different. It was a close-up of a hand, freshly severed, still wearing a ring that glinted in the light. I let the photo drop, my pulse pounding in my ears. The cellar felt smaller, the air tighter around me. I turned back toward the stairs, ready to leave, but something caught my attention on the floor. A trail of dark stains led from the shelves to a section of the wall, disappearing into a crack between the stones. Kneeling, I found that one stone was loose. I pried it free with trembling fingers, revealing a small hollow space behind it. Inside was another jar, smaller than the rest, its contents hidden by thick residue on the glass. I pulled it out carefully and wiped it clean, revealing something that made my chest tighten. Inside the jar was an eye, human, wide and staring, the iris a pale, icy blue. It floated perfectly preserved, as if it had been taken moments before. I set it back quickly, feeling my stomach churn, and stumbled toward the stairs without looking back. I climbed out of the cellar as fast as I could, my breathing ragged. The burned house around me felt even more sinister now, as if the walls themselves held memories of what had happened there. I crossed the threshold and hurried back into the forest, the silence pressing down heavier than before. Even when I was miles away, back on familiar ground, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I checked my hands constantly, half expecting them to disappear, to become part of a collection in a jar. That night, I dreamt of pale fingers tapping on glass, each ring gleaming faintly in the dark. Story 15. The old doctor's office had been closed for as long as anyone could remember. The building stood at the edge of town, its windows darkened with grime. The paint on the sign above the door long faded. I had passed it plenty of times growing up, always wondering what was inside. One day, curiosity got the better of me and I decided to take a look. The front door was surprisingly easy to open. It creaked loudly as I pushed it in, the sound echoing through the empty halls. Dust hung in the air like smoke, and the faint smell of mildew and something metallic made me hesitate. But I stepped inside anyway, telling myself I'd only look around for a few minutes. The reception area was frozen in time. A cracked leather chair sat behind the front desk, papers yellowed with age scattered across its surface. There was an old calendar on the wall. The date stopped in 1963. It felt like everyone had left suddenly and never returned. I moved through the hall slowly, my footsteps muffled on the dust-covered linoleum. Some of the doors were open, revealing exam rooms with rusted equipment and cracked sinks. Others were shut tight, their doorknobs cold and stubborn. I found myself holding my breath as I passed each one, listening for sounds I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. At the end of the hall was the exam room I had heard about from a friend. They said it was where the doctor did surgeries that weren't exactly legal, even back then. The door was open just a few inches, and I pushed it the rest of the way with my fingertips. The hinges groaned, and for a moment, I thought I heard something move inside. The room was larger than I expected. 2 gurneys stood in the center, their metal frames tarnished and cold. Thick leather straps, darkened with age, hung from the sides. Some of them had stains on them, and I didn't want to think too hard about what they might be. There was a film projector in the corner, its reel already turning. I hadn't noticed it until I heard the soft click and hum of it running. The light from the projector flickered on the far wall, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. I inched closer to see what was playing. The film was grainy and black and white. It showed a man in a white coat leaning over a patient on one of the gurneys. There were no surgical masks, no gloves, just bare hands working quickly and roughly. The patient wasn't unconscious. Their eyes were open wide, their mouth frozen in a silent scream as the doctor cut into them. I took a step back, but I couldn't stop watching. The doctor's expression was calm, almost bored, as if he were working on something routine. There was no sound from the projector, but I could almost hear the patient's cries in my head. The doctor kept glancing at the camera, as if acknowledging whoever was filming. I finally forced myself to look away and back toward the door. But when I turned, I saw that the door was now closed. I hadn't heard it shut, and my hand trembled as I reached for the knob. It wouldn't move. I pulled harder, but it was like the door was bolted from the outside. The projector clicked louder, and I turned back to see the film had changed. Now there were several people in the room, all of them in white coats, working on different patients. One of them looked directly at me through the flickering film. His expression was blank, but his eyes seemed to follow me as I moved. I stepped away from the door and pressed myself against the wall, trying to stay calm. There had to be another way out. I scanned the room and saw a second door on the far side, partially hidden behind a tall cabinet. I moved toward it, my steps slow and quiet. As I passed the gurneys, I thought I heard something move on one of them. I froze and glanced down. The leather strap twitched slightly, as if something had pulled against it. I didn't stay to find out more and hurried toward the second door. The handle was cold and slick in my hand, but it turned easily. I pushed the door open and found myself in a narrow hallway I hadn't seen before. The walls were lined with old medical charts, their papers curling and faded. The air smelled stronger here, like rust and something worse. I moved quickly, glancing back only once. The projector light still flickered in the exam room, but the film had gone blank. Just a white screen with shadows moving across it that didn't seem to belong to anything in the room. I turned away and kept going. At the end of the hall was another door. This one marked storage. I hesitated, but there was nowhere else to go. I pushed it open and found shelves of old equipment, jars with things floating inside, and piles of medical records. In the center of the room was another gurney, this one newer looking, with clean straps. I backed out of the room slowly, but before I could turn, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, heavy steps that echoed in the narrow space. I turned and saw a figure in a white coat standing at the end of the hall. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I knew who it was. I ran back the way I came, not thinking, just moving. The hallway seemed longer now, the walls closing in. The projector's flickering light grew brighter as I got closer, and I realized the film wasn't blank anymore. It was showing me, standing in the room, looking at the film just moments before. I threw myself at the door, and this time it opened. I stumbled out into the reception area, gasping for breath. The air was thick, but it was better than the hallway. I didn't stop moving until I was outside, the sunlight blinding and cold. I never went back to that building. Sometimes I drive by it and see the faint flicker of light through the dusty windows. Other times I hear the soft whir of a projector when the wind is still. I try not to think about the figure in the hall or the gurneys with their clean straps waiting. Story 16. The airfield wasn't on any map I could find, but word about it spread through a few old message boards. People mentioned it like a ghost story, an abandoned strip deep in the countryside, fenced off, no signs, no explanations. Curiosity got the better of me after weeks of reading rumors. One overcast afternoon, I drove out past where the paved roads ended and found the rusting gate, hanging crooked on its hinges. The chain link fence stretched in both directions, overgrown with weeds. I slipped through a gap where the links had broken apart, stepping into the wide, empty space beyond. The runway was cracked and split, grass pushing through the asphalt in jagged lines. Silence hung over the place, heavier than I expected, as though the airfield itself was waiting for something. I kept close to the shadows of the buildings lining the tarmac. Most were little more than empty shells, their windows shattered, their walls tagged with fading graffiti. Pieces of equipment lay scattered around, rusted beyond recognition. As I moved, I noticed how untouched the ground seemed, no footprints, no tire marks. It was as if no one had set foot here for years. Then I found the hangar. It was larger than the others, set apart at the far edge of the airfield. The sliding doors were half open, leaving just enough space to squeeze through. As I stepped inside, the smell hit me first: metal, oil, and something else, something sour that I couldn't place. I covered my nose with my sleeve and moved further in. There in the center sat an old jetliner. Its white paint was peeling, the letters and logos too faded to make out. The nose dipped slightly toward the concrete floor, and its windows stared out, black and empty. I approached slowly, taking in the sheer size of it. The closer I got, the more the wrongness of it all settled over me like a weight. The stairway was already lowered, rust clinging to its railings. I put one foot on the steps, testing them before climbing. They creaked under my weight but held. At the top, I hesitated for a moment before grabbing the handle and pulling the door open. It took some effort, but it swung inward with a moan. Inside, the plane was cold. The air smelled stagnant, thick with dust, and something else that made my stomach clench. At first, the interior looked like any stripped-down aircraft. Panels had been removed from the walls, and wires dangled from the ceiling. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw what the seats had been replaced with. Cages lined both sides of the fuselage, thick steel bars reinforced at the corners. Some were the size of kennels, others stood nearly upright, tall enough to hold something or someone inside. Heavy locks hung open on most of the doors, their chains coiled neatly beside them. The floor beneath each cage was stained dark in places, and the longer I stared, the more I realized those stains weren't just rust. I walked the length of the aisle, careful not to touch anything. The silence inside the jetliner was deeper than it had been outside, broken only by the soft scuff of my boots on the metal floor. Toward the rear of the plane, I found a small table bolted in place. On it sat a thick, spiral-bound notebook. Dust coated the cover, but when I opened it, the pages inside were clean. Lines and columns filled each sheet, all handwritten. At the top of every page was the word cargo followed by dates. Below that were lists of numbers, each corresponding to a weight, and beside each, the word undelivered. Page after page repeated the same structure. Some dates went back decades, others were more recent. None of the entries had been crossed out, and none of the cargo was marked as received or delivered. I felt my pulse quicken as I flipped through, looking for something that explained what this was. There were no names, no details, only weights and the same repeated word. I closed the notebook and stared at the cages again. My mind tried to come up with logical explanations, but none fit. I noticed scratches on the inside walls of some cages, long gouges like nails or claws had raked across the metal. In one, a strip of faded cloth hung from a corner, swaying gently in the still air. A dull clang echoed through the hangar, and I froze. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. I stood perfectly still, listening, straining to hear past the pounding of my heart. There was another sound, softer this time, a shuffle, like something dragging along the ground. I took one step back toward the doorway, then another. My boots scuffed the floor again, louder than before. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something at the far end of the plane, but there was nothing. Still, I didn't wait. I turned and hurried toward the open door, gripping the notebook tighter under my arm. Descending the stairs, I felt exposed. The empty hangar stretched wide around me, the sounds of movement no longer faint. I couldn't tell where they came from now. I reached the ground and broke into a jog, heading for the gap between the doors where I had entered. As I squeezed through, I caught sight of something inside the plane. A shadow moved behind the last row of cages, quick and deliberate. I didn't stop to look again. I ran, feet pounding over cracked concrete, until I reached the broken fence. The path back to my car felt twice as long. My breath came in sharp gasps, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I thought I heard footsteps in the brush, pacing mine. When I finally reached the vehicle, I didn't fumble for the keys. I had them ready in my hand the whole time. I drove without stopping until the airfield was miles behind me. Even then, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights or something worse. The notebook sat on the passenger seat, its presence heavy and wrong. I knew I should have left it behind, but something about it made me take it anyway. That night, I read through it again. New entries had appeared at the back, written in the same neat handwriting. The date was today's. Beneath it were 3 new weights, and one of them matched my own. Story 17. The cabin was smaller than I expected, tucked deep into the woods where the trail markers had long faded. It had taken me hours to find the place after parking my car and hiking the last few miles on foot. By the time I arrived, the sun was slipping behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. The place had an abandoned feel, but the door was unlocked like the listing promised. Inside, it smelled faintly of damp wood and old smoke, like someone had once built fires here and then forgotten the place. The furniture was basic, just a table, a single chair, and a narrow bed against the far wall. Dust covered most of it, except for the bed, where someone had recently pulled the blanket back. I set my pack down and glanced around, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. I told myself it was fine, just an old cabin listed on a hiking site for people looking for adventure. The kind of spot you brag about finding, off the beaten path. I unpacked my flashlight, a couple bottles of water, and the small journal I kept notes in when I hiked alone. As I settled in, I noticed something carved into the wooden headboard above the bed. The words were rough, dug deep into the wood, as if whoever had made them took their time. You won't wake UP. I stood there staring at it for a long time, my mouth dry and my heart beating harder in my chest. I told myself it was probably just some dumb joke. Maybe another hiker thought it would be funny to leave behind something creepy. But the longer I stared at those words, the less it felt like a joke. The edges of the carving were clean, not weathered at all, like it had been made recently. For a while, I sat at the table, flipping through my journal and writing down notes about the trail and the cabin. I could feel my eyes drifting back to the headboard every few minutes. The woods outside were silent, no crickets, no wind, nothing. Just an empty stillness pressing in on me from all sides. I made a small fire in the old stone fireplace, hoping the warmth would help me relax. The flames flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls and ceiling. Every creak of the old wood seemed louder than it should have been. I kept thinking about the message on the bed, hearing those words in my head like a warning I wasn't supposed to ignore. By the time I lay down on the mattress, it was nearly midnight. I left my flashlight close to my hand, just in case. I stared at the ceiling for a long time, listening to every sound. The mattress was stiff beneath me, and I could feel the uneven boards underneath. Eventually, exhaustion started to pull me under, but it wasn't restful. I woke up sometime later, unsure how long I had been asleep. There was a noise, faint but distinct, like footsteps outside the cabin. Slow, steady steps moving through dry leaves. I held my breath and waited, hoping it was just an animal. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, the beam shaking in my hand. The cabin door creaked quietly, moving inward by just an inch. I froze, heart pounding in my ears, straining to hear anything over the rush of blood in my head. There was nothing else. No footsteps, no breathing. Just the door shifting as if nudged by a slow breeze. For what felt like hours, I sat there in the bed, the light beam aimed at the door. My mind ran through every possibility, trying to find a logical reason for what I was hearing. When I finally gathered enough nerve to move, I crept toward the door, flashlight shaking. I pushed it shut and slid the old iron latch into place. The quiet returned, heavier now. I stood there, listening, waiting for the sound of footsteps to start again. They didn't. The woods outside remained silent. I backed away from the door slowly and sat down on the edge of the bed, not taking my eyes off it. That's when I noticed something else. There was a mark in the dust on the floor, near the foot of the bed. A trail like someone had dragged something heavy across the floorboards. I hadn't seen it before. It hadn't been there when I came in. The mark led from the door to the far corner of the room, where a small wooden trapdoor sat flush with the floor. I stared at it, flashlight beam fixed on the edges of the trapdoor. My stomach twisted and I felt cold all over. There was no way I was opening it. I stayed where I was, back pressed against the wall, breathing shallow and quick. The carved words behind me felt closer now, like they weren't just words at all. I waited for dawn, watching the door and the trapdoor, the light beam growing weaker as the battery drained. When the sky finally lightened through the dirty window, I gathered my things as fast as I could. I didn't bother folding the blanket or closing up the cabin like I normally would. I just left. And through. I ran most of the way back to where I had parked my car. The trail seemed longer in daylight, like the woods had shifted somehow during the night. When I finally reached the clearing where I had left my car, I expected to feel relief. But even standing by the driver's side door, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I drove without stopping until I reached the next town. I found a diner with a parking lot full of cars and stayed there for hours, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But I kept hearing those words over and over. You won't wake UP. Later, when I checked the hiking site again, the listing was gone. No trace of the cabin. No photos, no comments from other hikers, like it had never been there at all. But I know what I saw. I know where I slept that night. And I haven't been hiking alone since. Story 18. The zoo had been closed for almost 20 years by the time I decided to visit. Nature had started reclaiming it, vines wrapped around rusting fences, weeds split the pavement, and trees had forced their roots through the foundations of old structures. It was the kind of place people talked about in town, but no one seemed eager to revisit. They said it wasn't just the animals that had been kept there. I didn't believe in ghost stories or local legends, but something about the place drew me in. The main gate had been torn down long ago, so getting in wasn't hard. I made my way past the cracked ticket booths and faded murals of cartoon lions and elephants. The silence pressed in on me, broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath my boots. The cages were still there, most of them gaping open, their bars bent and broken. Old signs hung at odd angles, their paint faded and peeling. I passed what was once the reptile house, its windows shattered and its roof caved in. I didn't stop. I kept walking deeper, past the aviary and the big cat enclosures where vines hung down like curtains. Eventually, I found myself standing in front of something I hadn't seen on any of the old maps people had posted online. It was an enclosure, but unlike the others, the bars were thicker. The gate reinforced with several heavy chains still looped through the slats. There was no sign, no plaque telling visitors what had lived inside. I pushed through a gap in the fencing and stepped in. The air inside was different, cooler somehow, even though the roof had long since collapsed. The ground was cracked concrete, and in the center of it were restraints, not for animals. Not for anything I could imagine being shown to the public. They were human-sized, thick iron cuffs bolted into the floor, their metal worn but still solid. I crouched down, brushing dirt away from one of the restraints. The leather lining inside was rotted, but the bolts were unmovable. There were scratches on the concrete all around them, as if someone had dragged their feet or tried to while being held there. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the silence settle deeper into my chest. That's when I saw the wall. It was on the far side of the enclosure, partially hidden behind a leaning slab of wood. Tally marks covered nearly every inch of it, running from the ground to as high as I could see. Each line was carved deep into the surface, some overlapping where space had run out. I walked closer, tracing my fingers over them. They were rough, uneven, made by something sharp but not precise. There were thousands of them, endless rows of scratches that didn't stop. They climbed the wall, disappeared behind broken beams, and then reappeared again wherever there was space. The marks weren't old, not all of them. Some were faded and weathered, but others looked fresh, cleaner. I took a step back, suddenly aware of how exposed I was standing there, surrounded by silence and those marks. The air smelled faintly of rust and damp earth. I looked at the ground again. More scratches. Not tally marks, but gouges, deep ones that trailed from the restraints toward the wall. It was as if whoever had been here had dragged themselves toward it, over and over, until they made it or they were pulled back. There was something unsettling about how methodical it all was. The tallies were not chaotic. They were careful, deliberate, as if whoever had made them had all the time in the world. Or maybe they didn't. Maybe they just made time because they had nothing else. I turned around to leave, but something caught my eye near the base of the wall. A piece of metal half buried in the dirt. I knelt and dug it out slowly, finding a rusted knife. Its edge was dull, the handle wrapped in decaying tape, but it was clear how it had been used. There were flecks of something dark along the blade, long dried. I dropped it and stood quickly. The weight in the air was heavier now, like something watching me. I couldn't explain it, but it felt real. I backed away, not turning my back on the wall, on the restraints. My footsteps echoed strangely as I moved toward the gate. As I stepped through the opening in the fence, I heard something behind me. A faint scrape, like metal dragging against stone. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly I looked back, but there was nothing there. Just the empty space, the rusted cuffs, and the endless tally marks. I left then, faster than before, not caring about the noise I made. The pathways twisted and blurred in my rush to get back to the main entrance, but eventually I found my way out. The sky was darker than it should have been, heavy clouds rolling in. I didn't stop walking until I was back in my car with the doors locked. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those marks climbing endlessly up the wall. I kept thinking about the restraints, the scratches in the floor, the knife. What had they been keeping there? And why did it feel like something was still inside? A week later, I drove past the zoo again, just to prove to myself there was nothing there. The gate was still open, the place unchanged. But as I slowed down, I saw something different. The gate that led into that enclosure, those heavy chains were gone. There was nothing holding it closed anymore. The wind stirred the rusted fence, making it creak softly as it swayed. I didn't get out of the car. I didn't even slow down after that. But sometimes when I'm lying awake at night, I wonder how many more tallies are on that wall now, and who's making them. Story 19. The carnival had been closed for years, left to rot on the outskirts of town. People said it shut down overnight after something happened, but no one really knew what. The old ride still stood there, skeletal frames rusting away under the sun and rain. I'd passed by it dozens of times, always telling myself one day I'd stop and explore. It was a cloudy afternoon when I finally went in. I climbed through a gap in the chain link fence, boots sinking into the soft dirt. The air smelled faintly of mildew and rust, with an underlying scent I couldn't place. As I walked deeper, the sounds of the highway faded, leaving everything eerily quiet. The Ferris wheel loomed over me, its cars hanging crooked, swaying gently in the breeze. Nearby, the carousel was missing half its horses, and the ones left were cracked and broken. I ran my hand along one of them, the paint peeling away in strips under my fingers. The silence hung heavy, pressing in closer with each step. Toward the back of the grounds, I found a row of old trailers. Some had their doors hanging open, others were shut tight. Most were empty, filled with dust and broken furniture, long since picked over by scavengers. But one trailer, a faded green one with flaking paint, caught my eye. The door wasn't locked. It opened with a creak and a faint smell of damp paper and mold spilled out. Inside, it was dim, with grime streaking the single cracked window. A small table sat in the middle of the floor, and on it were several thick photo albums. I hesitated before stepping closer. The covers were faded leather, worn soft by time and use. I opened the first album slowly, unsure what I expected to find. The photos inside were old, some black and white, others faded color, but all of them were of children. Each page held 4 or 5 photos. Some of the kids smiled, some looked away from the camera. Most seemed to be standing in front of carnival rides or booths. There were names written neatly beneath each picture, along with dates. The handwriting was careful, almost delicate. As I turned the pages, a pattern started to form. Every few photos there was one that had been torn. Jagged edges cut through faces, leaving nothing but scraps behind. Beneath each torn photo were the words "last seen," followed by a date. I kept flipping through, feeling a cold knot twist in my stomach. Album after album, page after page, it was all the same. Smiling kids, then torn photos, always ending with "last seen." The dates stretched back decades, but some were more recent than I expected. The last album was different. It was smaller, newer looking, as if it hadn't been handled as much. I opened it, hands shaking now, and saw familiar faces, kids from town. One of them had lived in my apartment building. Another I recognized from a flyer at the grocery store. Each page ended the same way. Torn photos followed by "last seen." The last date written was less than a year ago. I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My mind kept circling back to the same sick thought someone had been keeping track. I closed the album and stood up, backing toward the door. As I did, I noticed something else. Along the far wall, there was a large corkboard covered in yellowed newspaper clippings. Missing person reports, articles about disappearances, even hand-drawn maps. Red string connected some of them, tying photos to locations. In the corner of the corkboard was a single photo, larger than the others. It was of a group of carnival workers, standing together and smiling. One face was circled in red ink, and beneath it, in block letters, was the wording. The man in the photo had a long face, a thin mustache, and eyes that seemed too dark. I couldn't tell if the photo was old or recent, but it didn't matter. My heart was pounding now, and I knew I had to leave. I stepped outside and pulled the door shut behind me, my hands slick with sweat. The sky had darkened, and the wind felt colder than before. As I moved back through the carnival grounds, I thought I saw something shift in the shadows. A figure, just at the edge of my vision, watching from behind the tilt-a-whirl. I didn't stop to look closer. My feet hit the ground faster, moving toward the fence without thinking. By the time I reached the opening in the fence, I was breathing hard. I forced myself not to run, glancing back once. The carnival looked the same as before. Empty rides, broken booths, and trailers falling apart. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still there. When I got home, I tried to forget about it. I told myself it was just an old place filled with junk. But the faces from the photo albums kept coming back. and the word him scrawled beneath that man's photo stayed fixed in my head. A few days later, I went online and searched for old news articles about the carnival. Most of what I found was vague, old stories about the place closing suddenly, rumors of accidents or crime. But one article mentioned a man who worked there, a performer, who vanished shortly after the carnival shut down. His name was Ernest Vale. I found an old photo of him in the article, and it was the same face from the corkboard, circled in red. Some people said he'd run off. Others whispered darker things. No one seemed to know where he went, or if he was ever found. That night, I dreamed about the carnival. I was back in the green trailer, standing over the photo albums, but the photos weren't old anymore. They were new, crisp, and clear. The last page showed a photo of me standing in front of the trailer, holding an album in my hands. Underneath was written, "Last seen." When I woke up, I wasn't sure if it was just a dream. But when I went to the window, I thought I saw something by the tree line. A shadow, unmoving, watching. I closed the blinds and haven't opened them since. I haven't told anyone about the albums or what I saw that day. Part of me wants to go back and burn that trailer down, destroy everything inside. But another part of me knows it won't matter. Whatever was started out there is still going. And I'm pretty sure it knows I was there. Story 20. The diner stood just off the highway, its windows boarded and paint peeling from the sides. I'd been driving for hours on a stretch of road that seemed to go on forever without a gas station or a place to rest. When I saw the rusted sign swaying in the wind, I figured it was worth a look. The parking lot was cracked and empty, but something about the place tugged at me, like I was supposed to stop there. The door wasn't locked. It groaned as I pushed it open, the sound echoing built a quiet building. Dust hung thick in the air, but the interior was surprisingly intact. All the tables were neatly set with plates, silverware polished to a shine, and glasses turned upside down, waiting to be filled. There was no sign of anyone inside. No cook in the kitchen, no waitress behind the counter. A faint hum filled the room, like old machinery still struggling to stay alive. I glanced around, half expecting someone to walk out from the back room, but the place remained still, heavy with a strange sort of quiet. I moved to one of the booths, the vinyl seat creaking under my weight. On the table was a menu, perfectly clean, without a smudge or wrinkle. Curiosity got the better of me, and I picked it up, expecting faded pictures of pancakes or sandwiches. Instead, the pages were lined with names. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Names, first and last, typed neatly in rows. Next to each name was a number, followed by a dollar sign. Some were cheap, $5, $10. Others were priced higher, some in the hundreds. I flipped the page slowly, expecting something different, but it was all the same. Every table had a menu just like it. I checked a few, and each one had different names. None of them made sense to me, though some of the names sounded familiar in a way I couldn't place. My chest felt tight, but I couldn't seem to stop myself from reading them. A clatter from the kitchen made me freeze. It sounded like a metal tray falling onto tile. I stood quickly, knocking my knee against the table as I backed away from the booth. The sound didn't come again, but I was suddenly aware of how cold the diner felt, like I'd stepped into a freezer. I should have left then, but something made me look behind the counter first. There was a cash register there, old and rusted, but it flickered with power, the display showing zeros. A bell sat next to it, and for a reason I can't explain, I reached out and tapped it. The sharp ring echoed too long, like it bounced around the empty room and slipped into places I couldn't see. A soft creaking sound came next, and I turned my head to find one of the doors in the back swinging open slowly. There was no one there, but the shadows inside seemed darker than they should have been. I told myself to leave, but my legs felt heavy as I stepped toward the back. The door led to a hallway lined with old photos on the walls. Some were pictures of people eating at the diner, smiling, plates full in front of them. Others were less clear, faded images of people standing stiffly in groups, their eyes wrung somehow too dark, too wide. The hallway ended at another door, this one slightly ajar. I pushed it open and found a room filled with filing cabinets. Folders were piled on top of them, some spilling open to reveal sheets of paper. I picked one up, my fingers trembling as I read the top line. It was a name. Below it was a description: height, weight, age. There was even a photo attached with a paperclip. I went through a few more, and it was the same each time. Names and numbers, all with prices scribbled at the top. Some of the photos were recent, others were decades old. I recognized one of the faces. A woman who'd gone missing when I was a kid. Her picture had been all over town for months before the search was called off. The air in the room thickened, and I realized how quiet it had gotten again. I put the folder back and backed away toward the door. Before I could reach it, the lights flickered once, then went out completely. In the dark, I could hear something moving, soft dragging sounds like feet sliding along the floor. I turned and ran, hands outstretched, scraping along the wall to find the way back. I hit the hallway, knocking a frame off the wall with a crash, and stumbled into the dining room. The tables were different now. The chairs were pulled out, like someone had just gotten up from each one. The meanest were gone. Ah! A sound came from behind me. A low whisper, not words exactly, more like something breathing close to my ear. I didn't look back. I made for the front door and yanked it open, the hinges screaming as I forced my way through. The daylight outside was harsh and blinding after the dim interior, but I didn't stop until I was back in my car. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking, engine sputtering to life after a few tries. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The diner still looked abandoned from the outside, but I saw movement behind one of the boarded windows, just the faintest shape shifting out of sight. I didn't tell anyone about the place for a long time, but later I started hearing stories. More people going missing along that stretch of highway. Names that sounded familiar. I remembered the menus, the prices, and I started to wonder who was buying, or worse, who was selling. Even now, sometimes when I'm driving late at night, I think I see the faint glow of a neon sign ahead. A diner with all the tables set, waiting for someone to stop in and take a seat. I never do. But the feeling stays with me like I was on the menu once, and they're still waiting for me to come back. Story 21. The barn stood at the edge of a forgotten field, weathered and leaning to one side as if the years had worn down its strength. The roof sagged in the middle, and boards hung loose, creaking whenever the wind pushed against them. It had been abandoned for years, maybe decades, but curiosity got the better of me that afternoon. I parked my truck by the fence line and climbed through a gap in the rusted wire, walking toward it with a strange sense of anticipation. Inside, the air was thick with dust and old hay, and the faint scent of mildew hung in the stillness. Light poured in through the gaps in the walls, striping the darkness with pale beams. The floor creaked under my boots, and I took slow, careful steps, testing each board as I made my way toward the back. I didn't know what I was hoping to find, but something about the place felt like it was holding on to secrets. I circled around an old tractor left to rust in the corner, its wheels half buried in dirt and debris. Birds' nests filled the rafters overhead, and I could hear the faint rustle of something small moving deeper in the shadows. Near one of the stalls, I found a pile of broken tools, handles splintered and rusted heads scattered like bones. Nothing unusual so far, just the remains of a place time had forgotten. But as I moved farther in, I noticed a section of the floor that looked different. The boards there were cleaner somehow, less worn than the rest, as if they'd been replaced more recently. I crouched down and ran my fingers over them, feeling how smooth they were beneath the layer of dust. Something about it didn't sit right, so I grabbed a piece of iron lying nearby and wedged it between two of the planks. It took a few minutes of prying and pushing, but eventually one of the boards gave way with a hollow snap. Beneath it was a dark space, maybe 2 feet deep, and something pale and dusty caught the light. I pulled back another board and then another, until the gap was wide enough to see clearly. Lying there, perfectly arranged in neat rows, were dozens of shoes. They were mostly women's and children's shoes. Small sneakers, tiny boots, scuffed flats, and delicate sandals, all lined up by size. Some were worn and stained, while others looked almost new. None of them matched, though they were all single shoes, left foot or right, never both. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of why they were there. The arrangement was too careful, too deliberate. It wasn't like someone had just tossed them in to be forgotten. They had been placed, each one given its own spot as if part of some ritual. I reached down and picked up a little red shoe, the kind a toddler might wear. It was dusty but otherwise clean. Inside the heel, someone had written initials in faded marker. As I looked closer, I realized many of the shoes had markings like that. Some had names, others had initials or dates. They weren't random. Each one seemed to belong to someone specific, and the careful placement started to feel even more disturbing. I set the red shoe back in its place and stood up slowly, scanning the rest of the barn. The silence pressed in on me heavier now, like the building itself was holding its breath. I took a step back, then another, not taking my eyes off the dark space beneath the boards. Something about those shoes told me I shouldn't have found them, that I wasn't supposed to be there. My hands were dusty and shaking as I replaced the planks as best I could. I turned to leave, but a sound stopped me cold. It was faint at first, like the creak of a loose hinge, but it wasn't coming from the door. It came from somewhere above me, up in the loft. I froze, listening, and then I heard it again, something shifting in the hay, slow and deliberate. I backed toward the entrance, trying not to make noise, but the floor betrayed me with every step. When I finally reached the door, I glanced back one last time. I thought I saw movement up there, just a flicker of something pale disappearing into the shadows. My pulse hammered as I stepped out into the daylight, the warm air feeling wrong against my skin after the stillness inside. I crossed the field fast, not running but close to it, and didn't stop until I was behind the wheel of my truck. I sat there for a while, staring at the barn, half expecting to see someone step out of it. But nothing happened. It stood there the same as before, leaning and silent, like it had never moved. I drove away slowly, watching it shrink in the rearview mirror, though the weight in my chest didn't ease until I was back on the main road. Later that night, I looked up missing persons reports from the area. There were more than I expected, going back decades. Women and children mostly. Many of them had never been found. Some of the names matched the initials I'd seen inside those shoes. I thought about calling someone, reporting what I found, but something held me back. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the sense that no matter who I told, nothing would come of it. Like the barn was a place that wouldn't give up its secrets that easily. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd gone up into the loft. if I'd followed that sound instead of leaving. But I didn't. And I never went back to find out. The shoes are still there, I'm sure of it, neatly lined up under the floorboards, waiting for someone else to find them. Story 22. The Ranger Tower stood on a ridge deep in the forest, long abandoned and weather-worn. Its metal frame creaked softly in the wind as I climbed the narrow stairs, each step groaning beneath my boots. I had planned to spend the night there, away from everything, just for the quiet and the view. The woods stretched for miles in every direction, and the nearest town was hours away. Inside, the tower was surprisingly intact. Dust coated the floorboards, and cobwebs hung in the corners, but the place felt solid. A wooden desk sat against the windowed wall, overlooking the vast darkening trees. There was an old radio on the desk, a heavy, boxy thing with a cracked speaker grill. I set my pack down beside the narrow cot and took a slow breath. The sun dipped behind the hills as I settled in. The forest below darkened quickly, shadows lengthening and merging into a wide, black sea. I made myself comfortable, unrolling my sleeping bag and lighting the old lantern I'd brought along. The tower's windows gave me a panoramic view, and for a while I just sat there, watching as the stars came out. The radio on the desk remained silent. I wasn't sure if it worked, but I hadn't brought it up there to use it. Still, there was something comforting about its presence, like a link to the old days when rangers kept watch over these woods. I imagined one of them sitting here years ago, making their notes, keeping an eye out for fires, listening to the silence. It was after 11 when I finally laid back, staring up at the ceiling beams. The forest below was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. There were no animal sounds, no distant calls of birds or coyotes. The stillness was thick, pressing in against the windows. I told myself that was normal out here, just the forest settling down for the night. At midnight, the radio crackled. The sudden burst of static made me sit up. The lantern flickered slightly as I stared at the old device. It hissed softly at first, a low wash of white noise like a distant waterfall. Then it cleared just enough for a voice to come through. "I can see you." The words were whispered, slow and deliberate. I felt a chill run through my spine. I waited, holding my breath, thinking maybe I had imagined it. But the voice came again, the same tone, like someone leaning close to speak directly into my ear. "I can see you." I got up and walked slowly to the desk. My fingers hovered over the radio's dials, though I didn't touch them. The machine sat still, speaker dark, no lights or indicators on. The voice was gone now, replaced by the faint crackle of empty air. I looked out the window, scanning the darkness below for any sign of movement. The woods were still. I couldn't see anything unusual, but the feeling of being watched settled over me like a heavy blanket. I stepped away from the desk, forcing myself to take slow, steady breaths. Maybe it was someone messing with an old radio frequency. Maybe a prank. That was the explanation I clung to, but it didn't sit right. I checked the door, making sure it was locked. The metal bolt slid easily into place, though the feeling of security it gave me was thin. I pulled the heavy curtain across the windows on the side where the moonlight shone in. Something about leaving them open made my skin crawl. An hour passed, maybe 2. I couldn't sleep. Every small sound, the wind tapping a loose board, the creak of the tower's frame made me tense. I kept glancing at the radio, half expecting it to light up again. It stayed quiet, but the memory of the voice hung in the air. I sat in the chair by the desk, watching the woods through a crack in the curtains. Nothing moved down there. Nothing flickered through the trees, but I still felt eyes on me. I thought about climbing down, leaving right then and there. The idea of making my way through the dark forest with only a flashlight seemed worse. Near 3 in the morning, the radio came to life again. The crackle was sharper this time, sudden and loud. I jumped to my feet, staring at the box. There was no dial moving, no light flickering, just that static, thick and close. Then the voice whispered again, softer than before, like it was inside the room. "Why did you come here?" The breath caught in my throat. I opened my mouth but couldn't speak. The radio was dead quiet again. I backed away from the desk, bumping into the cot behind me. Every instinct told me to run, but I was frozen in place, listening to the quiet return. I forced myself to move, grabbing my pack and stuffing my things inside. I kept the lantern lit, holding it close as I unlocked the door. The stairs groaned beneath my feet as I descended, each step feeling like it took an hour. I expected to hear something behind me, or to feel a hand grab my shoulder, but nothing happened. At the bottom, I stood still for a moment. The woods were silent again. My flashlight beam cut a narrow path through the trees and I followed it, moving as quickly as I could without breaking into a run. The trail was rough, the ground uneven, but I didn't stop. After nearly an hour of walking, I reached my car. I threw my pack in the back seat and slammed the door shut, locking it immediately. My hand shook as I turned the key in the ignition. The headlights cut through the darkness, and I drove away without looking back. I didn't tell anyone about the voice for a long time. When I finally did, people said it was probably interference, some random signal bouncing through the air. But I know what I heard. I know how close it felt. I never went back to that tower. A few months later, I heard it had collapsed during a storm. Sometimes I wonder if something in the woods pulled it down. Sometimes I wonder if the voice on that radio is still whispering to someone else. Story 23. The hospital had been empty for over a decade. Its windows were shattered and graffiti covered most of the lower walls. Nature had started reclaiming the building, with vines creeping up through cracks in the pavement and weeds pushing through the concrete. I had driven past it plenty of times, but one overcast afternoon I decided to finally go inside. The front entrance was chained shut, so I found a broken window along the side. Climbing through was harder than I expected, but eventually I made it in, landing with a soft thud on the dusty tile floor. The air inside smelled stale, like mildew and something faintly metallic. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing long corridors littered with debris. I walked carefully, trying not to make too much noise. Most of the rooms were empty, the walls stripped bare, but occasionally I passed rusted beds and overturned wheelchairs. The silence was heavy, broken only by the distant creaks of the old building settling. I kept going, deeper into the hospital, each step echoing a little too loudly. Signs still hung from the ceilings, some tilted at odd angles. I followed them until I reached the maternity ward. The double doors were slightly ajar, and when I pushed them open they groaned on their hinges. The hallway beyond was darker than the rest of the hospital, as though the windows here had all been covered or broken long ago. Inside the ward, the first thing I noticed were the cribs. They were lined up neatly along the walls, untouched by the chaos that had overtaken the rest of the building. Each one was small and white, though the paint was chipped and peeling. Dust coated every surface, dulling the metal bars and clouding the name tags hanging from each crib. I stepped closer to the first one. The tag was yellowed and brittle, but I could still make out the name written in faded ink. A dusty blanket lay folded at the foot of the crib. It wasn't until I reached out and brushed it with my fingers that I noticed the dark stain. It was reddish brown, old and crusted into the fabric. Moving from crib to crib, I found each one the same. A name tag, a blanket, and that same ominous stain. The names were different, but they all had something in common. None of them had last names. Just first names, like they hadn't been claimed or identified. The sense of unease grew with each one I passed. At the end of the row was a larger crib, more like a bassinet. Its blanket was darker than the others, almost black in places. The tag was torn, with only part of the name remaining. I leaned in closer, but the letters were too faded to read. The air felt colder here, as if something unseen had moved through the space. I backed away, scanning the room again. There were more cribs in the corner, partially hidden behind an old privacy curtain. It swayed slightly as though touched by a breeze, but the windows here were all sealed tight. I pushed the curtain aside slowly, the metal hooks scraping faintly along the rod. Behind it were 3 more cribs, smaller than the others, but set up the same way. Each one had a name tag, each one had a blanket. The stains here seemed fresher somehow, darker, almost wet. I touched one without thinking, then jerked my hand back immediately. My fingers felt cold, like I had dipped them in ice water. A sudden sound made me freeze. It was faint, but unmistakable, the creak of wheels turning on tile. I swung my flashlight around quickly, heart pounding. One of the cribs, the one I had just touched, was rocking slowly back and forth. The air felt heavier, pressing in on me from all sides. I took a step back, nearly tripping over something on the floor. It was a small shoe, dusty but otherwise clean, sitting neatly beside the crib. There was no other sign of anyone. The rocking stopped, and the silence that followed was worse than the sound had been. I turned toward the door, but something caught my eye along the far wall. There was a bulletin board, old and warped, with papers still pinned to it. Most were rotted and unreadable, but one page was still intact. It listed names and dates, and next to each was a single word, discharged or deceased. Most of the names matched those on the cribs. There was one more word, beside a handful of names at the bottom of the list. It said returned. The handwriting was different, sharper, almost carved into the paper rather than written. Those same names had no dates next to them, just blank spaces. The sound of something dragging across the floor made me spin around. Another crib had shifted, this one scraping slowly toward the center of the room. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I moved quickly, pushing back through the doors of the ward, the sound of metal scraping following me all the way to the hall. I didn't stop until I was back at the window I had come through. I climbed out as fast as I could, cutting my hand on the broken glass in the process. The fresh air outside hit me hard, but I kept going, not stopping until I reached my car. Even now, I can't explain what I saw in that hospital. I dream about the names sometimes, and those stained blankets. Sometimes I hear the soft squeak of wheels moving over tile, long after I've left that place behind. But the worst is the feeling I get when I think about the names marked returned, as if they're still waiting for someone to come back. Story 24. The old distillery sat at the edge of town, hidden behind overgrown trees and a rusted fence. People said it shut down decades ago, though no one seemed to know exactly why. I had passed it plenty of times growing up, always wondering what was inside. Curiosity finally got the better of me one cloudy afternoon, and I decided to take a look. The front door hung crooked on its hinges, creaking slightly as I pushed it open. The air inside was thick with dust and the faint, sour smell of old alcohol. Sunlight filtered through broken windows, casting thin beams that cut through the gloom. The main floor was filled with rusted equipment, rows of copper stills, and wooden barrels stacked haphazardly along the walls. I walked slowly, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight, some of them soft and splintered from years of rot. Broken glass crunched under my boots as I moved past the main distilling area toward a smaller door in the back. It was marked with a faded sign that read "Authorized personnel only." The door was heavy but not locked. I pushed it open and stepped into a long hallway, much darker than the room I'd just left. My flashlight cut a pale circle ahead of me, illuminating the narrow path. The walls here were stained and damp, and the smell changed, becoming something metallic and sharp. At the end of the hall was another room, larger than I expected. Vats lined the walls, each one tall and wide, made of thick iron with heavy lids. The words "special batch" were painted on them in chipped red letters. A few of them were sealed shut, but others had their lids cracked open just enough to see inside. I approached the nearest one and climbed up the side to peer through the opening. Inside was a dark liquid, thicker than any alcohol I'd ever seen. It had a slick surface, reflecting the beam of my flashlight in strange, oily patterns. Beneath the surface, something pale caught my eye. I leaned in closer, holding the light steady. Shapes floated just below the surface, unmoving but clearly solid. They weren't wooden staves or old equipment. I could make out the curve of a rib cage, the angle of a jawbone, and human teeth glistening faintly in the dim light. My stomach tightened as I pulled back, nearly slipping on the slick metal. I climbed down carefully, wiping my hands on my jeans as if I could get rid of the chill crawling up my skin. I moved to the next vat, shining the light through the crack in the lid. The same thing waited inside bones, stripped clean and pale, settled in the thick, dark liquid. I kept going, checking vat after vat. Some held more bones, some less, but all of them contained the same gruesome contents. One vat had a skull resting right at the surface, empty eye sockets staring up at me through the gloom. I stumbled back from that one, feeling bile rise in my throat. In the corner of the room was a workbench covered in old tools and ledgers. I made my way over, desperate to find some explanation. The tools were rusted but still recognizable: knives, saws, clamps. Their edges were dull, but dark stains marked their surfaces. I tried not to think about what those stains were. One of the ledgers lay open, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. The handwriting was neat but faded, listing dates, weights, and what looked like initials. Further down the page, there were notations: batch quality excellent, material sourced locally, and one that made me shudder: bones cleaned thoroughly prior to use. I flipped through more pages, each one detailing another batch, another set of initials. Some of the entries mentioned deliveries, marked by places I recognized from town, names I thought I knew. The realization sank in slowly. These weren't just anyone's bones. They had come from people who had lived nearby. A thick notebook sat beneath the ledger, its cover cracked and brittle. Inside were diagrams, drawings of human anatomy alongside distilling instructions. Some pages outlined how to render down bone, others detailed how to treat the remains for better extraction. I shut the book quickly, my hands shaking. Near the bottom of the workbench was a crate, half covered by a tarp. I pulled the tarp away and found it filled with glass bottles. Each was marked with special batch and sealed with wax. liquid inside was dark, almost black, with something suspended in it, small fragments of bone, teeth, and what looked like pieces of hair. I backed away, knocking into a stool that clattered loudly against the concrete floor. The sound echoed sharply, breaking the oppressive silence. I stood there, heart pounding, listening for any sign that I wasn't alone. The building remained still, but the air felt different now, heavier and more aware. I turned toward the door, ready to leave, but something caught my attention in the corner. A small pile of clothing, covered in dust and rot. I knelt down and saw that each piece had a name stitched into it. Some I recognized, missing people, ones I remembered from old flyers on telephone poles around town. I forced myself to stand, moving quickly but carefully back down the hallway. The distillery felt darker as I retraced my steps, the walls closing in tighter with every footfall. I reached the main room and hurried toward the broken door, pushing it open with more force than necessary. Outside, the sky was darker, clouds gathering as the sun dipped behind the hills. The wind carried a faint scent of smoke and something fouler beneath it. I didn't look back as I made my way through the weeds and past the rusted gate, feeling as if unseen eyes followed me the whole way. Even after I got back home, I couldn't shake the feeling. I washed my hands until my skin was raw, but the sense of something clinging to me never left. At night, I dreamed of vats filled with bones, lids creaking open in the dark, and bottles marked special batch waiting on shelves. The distillery still stands at the edge of town. People still whisper about it, but no one goes near. Sometimes, when the wind is right, you can smell something strange drifting through the trees. And once in a while, late at night, you can hear the faint clink of glass bottles being moved around inside. Story 25. The old graveyard sat on the outskirts of town, surrounded by leaning iron fences and thick clusters of trees. I had walked past it dozens of times, always meaning to explore but never finding a reason. That afternoon, something drew me in. The sky was overcast, the wind low, and there was a quietness to the place that made each step feel heavy. I wandered between the rows of crooked headstones, most of them weathered to the point where names and dates were hard to read. Some leaned together as though whispering secrets, while others stood isolated, marked only by simple stones. The deeper I went, the less I heard from the world outside. The trees blocked most of the light, casting long shadows that seemed to move as I did. After a while, I found myself near the back of the graveyard, where the grass was wild and untrimmed. The graves here were older, some barely visible beneath the weeds and ivy. That was when I noticed something strange, fresh earth. It was dark and loose, different from the hard-packed ground all around it. Curious, I walked closer and realized it was a hole. A grave-shaped hole. The dirt had been dug up recently, piled in a neat mound beside it. The edges were clean, not like the weathered graves around it, but crisp and sharp, as if someone had worked hard to make it perfect. Next to the hole sat a wooden box. At first I thought it might be a crate or maybe an old coffin left behind, but as I got closer, I realized it was brand new. The wood was pale and smooth, the corners tight, and there was no wear or rot on it. It was just my size. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the box and the open grave beside it. My skin prickled with a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. Something about it felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be seeing it, like I had stumbled into something waiting for me. I looked around to see if anyone was nearby, but the graveyard was silent. No wind, no birds, just me and the empty hole. I walked slowly around the box, half expecting someone to jump out and shout, but no one did. The box wasn't nailed shut. The lid rested lightly on top, slightly off-center. My fingers hovered over the edge before I finally pushed the lid aside. The inside was lined with dark fabric, soft and smooth like velvet. There was a faint smell, not of decay, but something sweet and cloying. It was empty. Completely empty. I took a step back and felt something shift behind me. When I turned, there was nothing there. Just the graveyard stretching out in all directions. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was just a prank or a strange coincidence. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt like I wasn't alone. The ground beneath my feet felt softer than it should have, as if it might give way at any moment. I backed away from the hole in the box, not wanting to turn my back, but not wanting to stay either. Every instinct told me to leave, to get out while I could. As I turned, I noticed something carved into a nearby headstone. It was faint, but I could make it out clearly: my name. My full name. The dates beneath it were impossible, with the death date listed as today. I stumbled backward, nearly losing my footing on the uneven ground. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My breathing came fast, shallow, and I felt a tightness in my chest. I looked back at the box, half expecting it to be gone, but it was still there, waiting. The lid had shifted again, opened just a little wider than before. A sound broke the silence, a soft scraping, like something heavy being dragged across wood. It came from the open grave. I forced myself to look and saw a pair of pale hands gripping the edge of the hole. Fingers, thin and long, the nails cracked and dark. They clawed at the earth, pulling something upward. I backed away slowly, every step feeling heavier than the last. Whatever was climbing out of the hole wasn't in a hurry. It moved slow, deliberate, as if it knew I wouldn't get far. I turned and ran then, my shoes slipping on the damp grass as I made for the gate. The graveyard felt endless. No matter how far I ran, the rows of stone stretched on. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I felt something cold brush against the back of my neck. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just kept running, forcing my legs to keep moving. Finally, I saw the gate ahead, its rusted bars barely standing upright. I pushed through it, not stopping until I was on the other side of the road. Only then did I look back. The graveyard was silent again. No sign of the open grave, the box, or the thing climbing out. I stood there for a long time, trying to catch my breath. The world seemed normal again. A bird sang somewhere in the distance. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of wet leaves. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the open grave and the box waiting for me. I heard the scraping sound and felt cold fingers brushing against my skin. Even in my apartment, with the doors locked and the lights on, I didn't feel safe. I decided not to tell anyone what I had seen. Who would believe me? But I never walked past that graveyard again. I took the long way around, even if it meant adding an extra mile to my day. Some nights, though, I swear I can hear the scraping sound outside my window. I don't go near cemeteries anymore. I don't visit graves, not even family. I don't want to see another box perfectly my size waiting for me, because I'm sure next time it won't be empty. Story 26. The factory sat on the edge of town, long abandoned and half swallowed by weeds. I had driven past it for years, always meaning to stop and take a closer look. Its broken windows and sagging roof gave it the look of something waiting to collapse, but it still stood, silent and looming. One overcast afternoon, I decided to finally go inside. Getting in was easier than I thought. One of the side doors had rusted off its hinges and leaned against the wall. I stepped carefully over the threshold, boots crunching on old glass. The air inside was stale, carrying the thick scent of rust and damp concrete. I stood there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the gloom. The main floor stretched out in front of me, a wide, empty space cluttered with debris. Machines sat quiet, most of them stripped of anything valuable long ago. A tangle of pipes hung from the ceiling like veins in an open wound. Water dripped from somewhere far away, the sound echoing through the hollow space. I moved slowly, boots scuffing over the dusty floor. Old footprints marked the grime here and there, but they were faint, their edges blurred by time. I followed the wall toward a narrow staircase leading up to the offices. Each step groaned under my weight, the metal railing sticky with something that left dark streaks on my hand. The hallway upstairs was lined with doors, most of them hanging open. Desks sat empty inside, chairs knocked over, papers scattered and yellowed. At the end of the hall was a door with a small window, its glass cracked but still intact. Stenciled letters flaked from the surface, just enough remaining for me to read manager. The door was unlocked. I pushed it open slowly and stepped inside. The office was in better shape than the rest of the factory, though dust coated everything in sight. A desk sat against the far wall, drawers half open. On one side of the room stood a tall filing cabinet, its gray paint chipped and stained. I crossed to the desk first. The drawers held nothing but old pens and empty folders. Some paperwork was still there, the text faded and mostly unreadable. I picked through it half-heartedly before turning toward the cabinet. Something about it felt out of place, too intact in a room where everything else was broken down. The handles were cold to the touch. I pulled open the top drawer and froze. Inside were rows of small plastic boxes, each carefully labeled with white tape. I lifted one out and held it in my hand, staring at the word written in neat, block letters, May 12th, Riverbank. Inside the box were teeth, human teeth, neatly arranged, perfectly clean and clearly chosen with care. I put the box down and opened another. June 3rd, parking lot, North District. More teeth, this time smaller, with a different color to them. I ran a hand over my face, breathing slowly, trying to think of a reason this made sense. None came. The deeper I looked, the more boxes I found, stacked neatly in rows that filled each drawer. Some were recent, the dates only a few months old. Others stretched back decades. The locations varied, some places I recognized, others I had never heard of. A few labels were vague, marked only by numbers instead of places. There was a system to it, but I couldn't figure out what it meant. One drawer was locked. I searched the office and found a key taped under the desk, crusted with grime. It slid into the lock and turned with a stiff click. Inside were fewer boxes, but these were different. The teeth here were set in resin, arranged in the shape of jaws. Some looked cracked and broken, others perfect, almost too perfect. Each one had a name instead of a location. I stepped back, heart pounding harder than it should have. The room felt colder suddenly, as if the temperature had dropped in an instant. I told myself I should leave, but something kept me rooted there, staring at those names. One of them was familiar, and after a moment I realized it had been someone I went to school with. She disappeared years ago. They never found her. I closed the drawer slowly and wiped my hands on my jeans. The urge to get out of the building was stronger now, and I moved toward the door. On the desk, something caught my eye, another notebook, smaller than the one I had seen in the cabinet. It was open, and the writing inside was fresh. The last entry listed a new date, today. The location matched the factory itself. Beneath it was another line, blank except for the word pending. I stared at it, feeling the weight of the silence around me deepen into something suffocating. The floor creaked behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. Only the faint sound of breathing that didn't belong to me. My hands were shaking now as I backed toward the door, eyes scanning every shadow in the office. The breathing grew louder, slow and steady, like whoever it was didn't care if I heard them. I stepped into the hallway, keeping my back to the wall. The stairs were just ahead, but they felt farther away with each step I took. Something brushed my shoulder, a cold touch that sent a jolt through my chest. I ran then, feet slamming against the metal stairs as I scrambled down. The factory floor was darker now, or maybe it just seemed that way. I didn't stop moving, heading straight for the door I'd come in through. Every instinct screamed at me to run faster. As I reached the opening, I heard footsteps above, slow and deliberate, moving toward the office where I had been. I didn't look back. I made it through the broken door and out into the overgrown yard. My car sat where I'd left it, keys already in my hand by the time I reached it. I drove away with the factory shrinking behind me in the rearview mirror. It looked as lifeless as before, but I knew better now. Later that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the teeth, about the labels and names. The notebook's last entry burned in my memory. I checked the mirror constantly, feeling like something was waiting just out of sight. I still have the key I found under the desk. I keep it hidden, but I think whoever was there knows I took it. Story 27. The hostel was one of those old brick buildings you find tucked away in European towns, full of charm and history. It had once been a mansion, converted over the years into affordable lodging for backpackers and tourists. The reviews mentioned creaky floors and thin walls, but they also praised its character and the friendliness of the staff. After weeks of travel, it seemed like a good place to take a break for a couple of nights. When I arrived, the receptionist greeted me warmly and handed me a brass key attached to a worn leather tag. The room was on the second floor, up a narrow staircase that tilted slightly to one side. My bed was near a window that overlooked a quiet courtyard. Everything about the place felt old but welcoming, like it had seen thousands of travelers pass through over the years. Later that evening, I wandered into the common area, looking for a place to relax. The room had an inviting atmosphere with mismatched chairs and a large wooden table where a few guests were playing cards. The walls were covered with framed paintings, maps, and postcards from all over the world. And then there was the photo wall. It stretched from floor to ceiling, covered entirely in Polaroids of smiling guests. Some were holding mugs of coffee, others making peace signs or hugging each other. Names and dates were scrawled in marker beneath each photo. At first it seemed like a sweet tradition until I noticed the eyes. Almost every photo had the same thing. The eyes were crossed out in thick red ink, slashed through roughly as if done in a hurry. It wasn't something subtle or part of some quirky theme. It was jarring, like a warning someone wanted to make sure you couldn't miss. I stood there, staring at the photos, feeling the back of my neck prickle. I asked one of the other guests about it, a girl from Australia who was shuffling cards at the table. She glanced at me and then at the wall, shrugging like it wasn't worth mentioning. "They were like that when I got here," she said. "Kind of creepy, right?" Then she smiled and went back to her game. Nobody else in the room seemed bothered by it. Later that night, after I'd gone up to my room, I kept thinking about those pictures. I tried to tell myself it was probably just some weird hostel tradition. Maybe it was a joke between travelers. But the longer I lay in bed, the more uneasy I felt. Something about those red X's over all those smiling faces wouldn't leave my mind. I got up and pulled back the curtain to look outside. The courtyard was empty, dimly lit by a single old lamp mounted on the wall. Its glow barely reached the cobblestones below. There was movement, though something shifting just out of the corner of my eye. When I turned to look, nothing was there. The walls of my room were thin enough that I could hear the creak of footsteps from the hallway. Slow, steady steps moving past my door, pausing for just a moment. I held my breath, listening hard. After a few seconds, they continued down the hall, fading into silence. The next morning, I went down to the common area early. There was nobody else around yet. In the daylight, the photo wall seemed less menacing but still unsettling. I stepped closer, examining the ink marks. They were all the same shade of red, all thick and uneven like they'd been drawn with the same marker. Something about one photo caught my eye. It was newer than the others, dated just a few days ago. The girl in the picture looked familiar. I realized she was the Australian girl I'd spoken with the night before. Her eyes were crossed out, too. Beneath her photo, someone had written her name Rachel and the date. I looked around the room, but there was no sign of her. I didn't see her at breakfast. When I asked the receptionist, she frowned slightly and said Rachel had checked out early that morning, but I hadn't heard anyone leave. The front door was old and heavy. It made a loud scraping noise when it opened. I would have noticed. That evening, the common area filled up again. New guests arrived, chatting and swapping stories. Some took new Polaroids and added them to the wall. I watched as a guy pinned his photo onto a blank spot, laughing with his friends. Hours later, someone had already crossed out his eyes. I decided to stay awake that night. I sat on my bed with the light off, listening. The footsteps came again around midnight, slower this time, almost deliberate. They stopped outside my door. I could hear breathing, soft and uneven. After a long pause, the handle turned, but the door was locked. Whoever was out there stood for another minute before walking away. In the morning, I found another Polaroid had been added to the wall. It was the guy from the night before, but this time the X's were darker, thicker, like someone had pressed harder with the marker. I asked the receptionist again if anyone had checked out, but she shook her head. "No one's left since yesterday," she said. By the third night, the hostel felt different, colder, quieter. Fewer people lingered in the common area. The photo wall had more pictures, more crossed-out eyes. Some of the guests I'd seen the day before were gone, their bunks stripped of sheets. Their names were marked under the photos with recent dates. I packed my things at dawn. I didn't wait for breakfast. I just wanted out. As I came down the stairs with my bag, I passed the common room one last time. My own photo was on the wall now. I hadn't posed for it. I hadn't stood for any pictures. But there it was, a Polaroid of me smiling, my eyes crossed out in red ink. I didn't say anything to the receptionist as I left. She didn't say anything to me either. Just watched as I stepped out into the street. I walked fast, not stopping until I was a few blocks away. Even then, I could still feel the weight of all those crossed-out eyes watching me from behind the hostel's old windows. I never went back. And I never figured out who kept taking those photos or what happened to the people in them. But sometimes I still dream about that wall covered in faces I recognize, smiling with their eyes gone. And I wonder how many more Polaroids have been added since I left. Story 28. The farmhouse was farther out than I expected. Miles from the nearest town, the dirt road leading up to it was choked with weeds and potholes. The place had been abandoned for years, but something about it still seemed alive in a way I couldn't put my finger on. I parked my car at the bottom of the hill, next to the old barn with a collapsed roof. and walked the rest of the way up. The house itself was weathered and gray, leaning just slightly as if the wind had pushed it one too many times. The windows were streaked with grime, their shutters hanging loose. I stood at the front door for a moment, debating whether to go in. Then, curiosity got the better of me, and I pushed it open with a loud creak that echoed into the empty rooms beyond. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the smell of old wood and dampness. The floorboards groaned underfoot as I moved through the house, taking in peeling wallpaper and furniture draped in dusty sheets. It was the kind of place that made you think twice about stepping inside, but I had always been drawn to places like this. Forgotten places, places that felt untouched by time. I made my way room by room, finding nothing remarkable at first. A rusted bed frame, a broken mirror, a wooden rocking chair that creaked when I brushed past it. Everything was as I expected until I found the stairs leading to the attic. They were narrow and steep, the railing splintered and loose beneath my hand as I climbed. The attic door was already open when I reached the top. Pale light filtered in through a small, circular window on the far side of the space. Dust swirled in the air, catching the light like tiny flecks of ash. At first I thought I was alone up there, but then I saw them. Mannequins. 5 of them standing in a crooked line near the window. Their plastic faces were blank, their arms stiff at their sides. What made me stop cold was the clothing they wore. It wasn't old-fashioned or moth-eaten like I might have expected. It was new, familiar, too familiar. I stepped closer, my throat tightening as I studied each one. The first mannequin wore a green jacket, the exact shade and style as the one folded in my suitcase in the trunk of my car. Beneath it was a black hoodie and a pair of jeans, identical to the ones I had packed for this trip. I moved to the next figure, my heart pounding faster. It had on a gray t-shirt with a small tear near the collar, just like one I had left neatly folded beside the others. The sneakers on its feet were the same brand and color as mine, down to the scuffed toe on the right shoe. I backed away a step, trying to make sense of it, but there was no explanation that made sense. I had packed those clothes myself. No one had seen them. I had driven straight here without stopping. And yet, here they were, arranged on lifeless figures in the attic of an abandoned farmhouse. My hands trembled as I turned in a slow circle, scanning the rest of the attic for anything, anyone. In the far corner, I noticed something else. A wooden table covered in neatly stacked papers. I approached cautiously, each step making the floor creak beneath me. On the table were photographs, dozens of them, some old and faded, some newer. All of them were of people standing in front of this house, smiling, posing unaware. I picked one up, my fingers smudging the corner. A man stood in front of the porch, leaning against the railing. In another, a woman waved at the camera with a wide grin. I didn't recognize any of them, but the last photo made me freeze completely. It was of me, standing by my car earlier that day, keys in hand, looking off toward the house. I hadn't posed for that picture. I hadn't noticed anyone around when I got here. But someone had been watching. Someone had taken that photo without me knowing. My chest felt tight as I forced myself to set it back down, my fingers numb. I turned toward the mannequins again, and something about them seemed different. Closer, maybe. I couldn't be sure, but the space between us felt smaller. I backed toward the stairs, never taking my eyes off them. The attic was silent except for the sound of my breathing and the faint whisper of wind through the cracked window. Halfway to the stairs, I heard something scrape behind me. I spun around fast, but there was nothing there. Just more dust and broken boards. When I turned back to the mannequins, one of them had shifted. The head tilted slightly to the left. I hadn't seen it move. I didn't want to believe it had. I took the stairs down 2 at a time, ignoring the sharp sting of splinters in my hand as I grabbed the railing. The house groaned around me, the walls close and suffocating. I reached the front door and yanked it open, stumbling onto the porch. The air outside was sharp and cold, but I barely noticed. My car was still parked down by the barn, and I ran for it without looking back. When I reached it, I fumbled with the keys, finally unlocking the door and throwing myself inside. I hit the lock button and sat there, chest heaving, staring at the house. For a long moment, nothing happened. No movement in the windows, no figures at the door. But I didn't feel safe. After a while, I started the engine and drove away, dirt and gravel kicking up behind me. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back in the center of town. When I finally checked the trunk, my suitcase was still there, but the clothes inside were gone. Every piece I had packed was missing, leaving nothing but an empty shell of fabric where they should have been. Story 29. The abandoned train station sat on the edge of town, surrounded by overgrown tracks and crumbling concrete. People said it had closed decades ago after the rail line stopped running that route. Most avoided it, claiming it was dangerous or that it gave them a bad feeling. I had driven by it plenty of times and finally decided to take a look for myself. The air grew colder as I stepped through the rusted gates, boots crunching on broken glass and gravel. The building itself was worn, with faded signs hanging crooked above the entrances. Windows were either broken or caked with grime, barely letting any light through. I stood there for a moment, taking it in before pushing open one of the heavy doors. Inside, the station was silent. My footsteps echoed against the high, curved ceilings. Benches lined the walls, though most were split or missing sections of wood. On one side, a large schedule board still hung, its letters faded and dates far out of use. The names of the destinations were mostly familiar towns, but a few I didn't recognize at all. The ticket booth sat near the far wall. Its glass was dusty but unbroken, and the small door behind it hung slightly ajar. I stepped closer and peered inside, expecting to find old papers or maybe some broken equipment. What I found instead made me pause. There were maps spread across the counter, some neatly folded, others unfurled and weighed down with metal paperweights. I picked one up and studied it. The names of the towns weren't any I had ever heard of, and the routes twisted in strange, impossible patterns. Some of the stops were marked with symbols I didn't understand, circles with slashes through them, triangles with dots at their centers. I set the map down and picked up another. Same thing. Places that didn't exist, at least not anywhere I knew. The more I looked, the more disoriented I felt. None of them included roads or landmarks I could recognize. It was like they charted an entirely different world. Behind the maps, there was a small wooden drawer. I opened it and found a stack of train tickets inside, each stamped with today's date. The tickets were crisp, as if they had just been printed. They listed destinations matching the strange names on the maps, places like Halver's Rest, Stern Hollow, and Blackgate. The times for departure were all later that evening. I stared at them, a shiver running through me. The station had been closed for years. No trains had run through here in my lifetime. Yet here were tickets, fresh and ready, as if the line was still active. I picked one up and turned it over. On the back, in faint letters, was printed "No return." I set the ticket down carefully and glanced at the clock on the wall behind the booth. It wasn't working, the hands frozen at midnight. Still, I checked my watch. The first departure listed on the ticket was less than an hour away. I left the ticket booth and walked down toward the platform. Grass and weeds had pushed up between the planks, and the tracks themselves were rusty and bent in places. But as I stood there, I heard something faint, the distant whistle of a train growing closer. It didn't make sense. I stepped back, heart racing, and watched as the sound grew louder. Then I saw lights, faint at first, cutting through the gloom at the far end of the tracks. A train was coming, moving steadily toward the station, its engine shining like polished metal. The train looked old but well kept, nothing like the rusted shells left abandoned on the other lines. It slowed as it approached the platform, wheels screeching softly as it came to a stop. The doors opened with a hiss, and I saw people inside. They sat quietly in their seats, facing forward, unmoving. I didn't board. I just stood there, watching. No one got off. No one waved me in. The conductor, dressed in a dark uniform, stepped out and stood silently by the door, staring at me. I couldn't make out his face clearly, but I had the feeling he was waiting. I backed away slowly, shaking my head. The conductor remained still for a long time before stepping back inside. The doors hissed shut again. Without a sound, the train began to move, gliding smoothly down the tracks and vanishing into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. Once it was gone, the platform felt colder. I returned to the ticket booth, thinking I might find something to explain what had just happened. I rifled through the drawers and cabinets but found nothing more. Just old keys and faded timetables that didn't match anything I'd ever seen. I took one of the maps with me when I left. I thought maybe I could show it to someone, try to figure out if any of the places were real. But when I got home, the map was different. The names had changed. The routes twisted even more, looping in on themselves. Each time I looked at it, it shifted, the towns moving, vanishing, or being replaced. It didn't make any sense. I tried to take photos, but they came out blurry, as if the camera couldn't focus on it. Eventually, I stuffed it into a drawer and tried to forget about it. A week later, I found another ticket in my mailbox. It had my name printed on it, with the same destination as before Blackgate. The departure time was midnight. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't go. But now, every night, I hear the distant whistle of a train. Sometimes I see lights down the street, flickering in and out like something's waiting there. The map is still in my drawer, and sometimes I swear I hear the faint rustling of paper coming from it. I don't know where that train goes, and I don't want to find out. But I have a feeling that one day soon I won't have a choice. Story 30. The hike to the lighthouse took longer than I expected. The trail wound through thick forests and over rocky cliffs, the sea always visible but never quite close. I'd read about the place in an old guidebook, which claimed it was abandoned decades ago. There was something about the isolation that drew me in, a sense of quiet that I'd been craving. By the time I reached the island, the sky was already darkening. The lighthouse stood tall against the gray clouds, its white paint faded and chipped. The glass of the lantern room was cracked in places, and the entire structure leaned ever so slightly, as if tired from years of holding its ground. I made my way to the keeper's quarters first, hoping to find some shelter before the rain started. The door creaked open without much effort. Inside, the air was thick with dust and salt, the scent of old wood and mildew heavy in my nose. The furniture was still there, an old table, a few chairs, a narrow bed against the wall. Papers were scattered across the table, along with a rusty lantern and a few empty bottles. I set my pack down and brushed some of the papers aside. That's when I noticed the journal. It was thick, bound in cracked leather, and when I opened it, I realized it was a logbook. Each page listed names, dates, and brief notes about visitors to the island. Some entries were old, written in faded ink with careful handwriting. Others were newer, the script darker and shakier. Flipping through the pages, I read the entries aloud quietly to myself. There was a fisherman who came to repair the dock, a pair of hikers who stopped to rest during a storm, a group of surveyors who spent 2 days mapping the coastline. The notes were short but strangely precise, sometimes including the time of arrival and departure. I wasn't sure who had been keeping the records. The lighthouse had been shut down for years, according to everything I'd read. Yet the entries continued, up until a few days ago. That's when I saw my name, written neatly, just like the others. The time listed was only a few hours earlier. The note beside it read, "Arrived alone." My chest tightened as I stared at the entry. No one knew I was coming out here. I hadn't told anyone about the trip. I ran my fingers over the page, half expecting it to smudge, but the ink was dry. The handwriting was clear, and I was sure it wasn't mine. I closed the journal and stood up, listening. The room was quiet except for the sound of the wind outside, but now I felt a presence I hadn't noticed before, like someone who was just out of sight, watching. I moved to the window and looked out, but there was nothing there, only the empty path I'd taken to get here. Trying to shake the feeling, I decided to explore the rest of the building. There were 2 other rooms. One was a small kitchen, its shelves bare except for a few cans with labels too faded to read. The other was a narrow stairwell that led up to the lantern room. I hesitated for a moment before starting up the stairs. Each step creaked under my weight, the sound loud in the silence. The higher I climbed, the colder it got. By the time I reached the top, I could see my breath. The lantern room was empty except for the huge glass lens, its surface cracked but still catching the light of the setting sun. I circled the room, looking out through the glass in every direction. The ocean stretched out endlessly, no boats or signs of life anywhere. Turning back toward the stairs, I noticed something carved into the wall. It was a list of names. Some were familiar from the journal, others weren't. At the bottom of the list was mine, carved deeply into the wood. I ran my hand over it, feeling the roughness of the letters. They were fresh, the wood still raw and splintered. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Who was keeping these records? And why was I already on the list before I had even arrived? The sun dipped below the horizon and the room darkened. I heard the faint sound of footsteps from below. Slow, deliberate, climbing the stairs I had just used. I pressed myself against the wall, holding my breath, waiting to hear more. The footsteps stopped, and for a long moment there was nothing. Then the stairs creaked again, closer this time. I glanced around the room for something to defend myself with, but there was nothing but the old lens and broken pieces of wood. I edged toward the door, preparing to make a run for it, when the footsteps stopped again. This time they were right outside the room. I braced myself as the door slowly creaked open, but no one was there. The stairs beyond were empty, though the sound of footsteps still echoed faintly, as if they were inside the walls themselves. I didn't wait to find out more. I rushed down the stairs, my feet pounding against the steps, and back into the keeper's quarters. The journal was gone. The table was empty, as if it had never been there. My pack was still by the door, and I grabbed it quickly. As I turned to leave, I noticed something else. A new piece of paper pinned to the door. It had today's date, my name at the top, and underneath it, a single word, departed. I yanked the door open and stepped outside, breathing hard. The sky was fully dark now, the stars bright but offering little comfort. I hurried down the path toward the dock, but something felt different. The trail seemed longer, unfamiliar turns and bends where there hadn't been any before. I kept walking, pushing through the undergrowth, my flashlight flickering as I moved. Hours seemed to pass, but I never reached the shoreline. The path only looped back toward the lighthouse, no matter which direction I chose. Each time I emerged from the trees, the tower loomed closer than before. The lantern room was now lit, a pale, flickering glow that turned slowly as if someone had lit the beacon again. I watched it sweep across the island, and every time it passed over me, I felt colder. I stood there, breathing hard, trying to think of another way off the island. But I knew deep down there wasn't one. The logbook had recorded my arrival. It had marked my departure. And now, like all the names before mine, I belonged to the lighthouse.